Yanis Varoufakis is a world-renowned economist and a former member of the Greek parliament. He was Minister of Finance for 7 months and resigned shortly after the people of Greece voted overwhelmingly against the continuation of austerity policies imposed by the Troika. He's also Professor of Economic Theory at the University of Athens and the author of numerous books, the latest being "And the Weak Suffer What They Must: Europe's Crisis and America's Economic Future." Yanis Varoufakis, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
So I want to start off with some historical context. In your book, The Global Minotaur, you state, "There's no such thing as a Greek crisis, but rather that Greece is a symptom of a broader shift in global economic history." Do you think that policymakers and everyday people should reevaluate their understanding of the crisis? And can you also take us through history and help us understand this?
Imagine we were in 1930 in South Dakota or in Delaware, and we were discussing the Delaware crisis or the South Dakotan crisis. It would be absurd. Of course, South Dakotans were suffering. Of course, the weakest part of the United States of America were in dire straits. But the crisis was a crisis of global capitalism, and in particular of American capitalism. And if it weren't for the New Deal that Franklin Roosevelt introduced throughout the United States, and if it wasn't, even worse, I should say, for the Second World War, which lifted aggregate demand and ended the crisis that had been unleashed by the financial sector collapse in 1929, then that crisis would have continued. Similarly, Greece is the weakest link in the European chain. Therefore, it's the first domino to have fallen, and it has fallen very badly for the Greek people. But to think of it as a Greek crisis is to misunderstand, misconstrue what's been going on. There is one crisis, the crisis of the Eurozone, and it takes many different forms. So for instance, here in Germany, where we are now speaking, it takes the form of negative interest rates. So if you're a pensioner, your pension fund is in trouble because they cannot invest your money and get interest in order to add to your capital for a rainy day or for when you retire. In places like Ireland, you have a dual economy. You have the Irish who managed to be connected to Facebook and Google, and they're doing reasonably well, and the others who are not, and they're doing very badly. You have a situation where France has a debt that is unsustainable as we speak, and a budget deficit which cannot be contained without creating greater social tensions and possibly giving rise to a Marine Le Pen presidency. All these are parts of the same crisis, and until and unless we look at it as one crisis, with a view to identifying the causes of this crisis and the remedies for this crisis as a whole, we are going to be continuing along the path of denial, the price of which is Europe being the sick man and woman of the global economy.
So you state that it was the fall of the Bretton Woods system that occurred, and that America turned into a deficit nation, sucking up all the capital surpluses of the world, and it played as a recycle, if you want to put it that way, of people's labor, profits. And it was the collapse of this system, this recycle mechanism that Wall Street played, that led to the European crisis today. Is that an accurate depiction?
Let me restate, yes, but let me restate it using my own words. Mm-hmm. Capitalism requires surplus recycling. Just like the planet requires environmental recycling, so does capitalism require a mechanism that takes the surpluses, the profits if you want, from where they're being produced and invests them in areas that are in deficit, that have losses, where demand is low and employment is high. Unless you have this recycling mechanism, capitalism fails. These recycling mechanisms are part and parcel of every major state, or have been for 200 years now. Germany had it, Britain has it, so think of Yorkshire as a deficit area and London as a surplus area. Unless you have the British state recycling those surpluses from London to Yorkshire, the English Union breaks down. And that applies to the global level as well. The Americans understood this perfectly well as we were exiting the Second World War, and this is why they set up Bretton Woods. And Bretton Woods had two pillars. One was stability of foreign exchange rates, managing the value of money throughout the global capitalist economy. That was one pillar. And the second pillar was recycling. For the first 10, 15 years of Bretton Woods, the Americans were recycling their own surpluses. They were the only surplus country, effectively. Europe was in ashes after the Second World War. And the Americans, think of the Marshall Plan. It was not a philanthropic exercise. There was an element of philanthropy, an element of geopolitics, pushing the Soviets away from the heart of Europe. But from an economic point of view, from a macroeconomic point of view, the purpose of the Marshall Plan is to take dollars surplus from America, give it to the Europeans, so the Europeans could buy American exports. And this lasted as long as America had a surplus. But towards the the end of the 1960s, America lost its surpluses. And there was a great worry in Washington, D.C. at the time. How can we remain dominant if we have no surpluses to recycle? And the answer that they gave, people like Paul Volcker, was brilliantly simple and audacious. And it was, okay, if we can't recycle our own surpluses because we don't have any, we'll recycle other people's surpluses. So from the 70s onwards, with the collapse, the willful distraction by the Americans who had created Bretton Woods, what we have was a second post-war phase where America operates like a huge vacuum cleaner. It sucks into its territory the exports of Germany, of Holland, of the oil exporting countries, of oil, in other words, of Japan, later China. And how was it paying for this deficit? By sucking into Wall Street the profits of those companies, of the foreigners. So it was recycling other people's money, other people's surpluses. And it was doing this magnificently and audaciously up until 2008, until the financialization bubbles that were built on this capital flow to Wall Street exploded. And since then, this recycling mechanism worldwide has broken down. And we have a global crisis. Europe, because we tried to create a mini Bretton Woods here with effectively the euro, but without recycling mechanisms within Europe, we are the sick man or woman of the global economy because we don't have this recycling mechanism within our territory.
So it's not social security programs, it's not inflexible labor markets, this is the root of the crisis, if I understand you correctly.
Let me give you a very simple example, because if you can't explain this simply, you don't understand it. It's very simple. Compare Nevada and Ireland. Two states that are very different in terms of aesthetics. One is green, the other is desert, but in terms of population, more or less the same. Mm-hmm. The economy is based on low corporate tax rates, on financial companies, on real estate, very similar to Ireland. Now, compare and contrast what happened in 2008 in Nevada with what happened in Ireland. And do it by imagining that the dollar zone, the United States of America, were structured like the Eurozone was. What would have happened to Nevada? I'll tell you what would have happened. If America was structured the way Europe is, catastrophically, in other words. Okay, what would have happened is this. The first thing that went wrong in both Nevada and Ireland was that real estate went down, prices collapsed, developers lost their money, they couldn't pay the banks went bust. Yeah? The difference was that in the United States it was the Federal Reserve, and the FDIC that salvaged the banks of Nevada. If the state of Nevada had to borrow internationally in order to bail out the banks and pay for the unemployment benefits of the construction workers like the Irish had, then the state of Nevada and the banks of Nevada and the economy of Nevada would have gone down the drain. And then there would be a domino effect throughout the United States. This is exactly what happened in Europe. We have a common currency, but we don't have these shock-absorbing recycling mechanisms that the United States has developed over a period of 150, 180 years.
Welcome to acTVism Munich for a second part of our exclusive interview with former Finance Minister of Greece and the founder of the Democracy in Europe Movement 25, Yanis Varoufakis. In this segment, I talked to him about a number of issues, which include the impacts that the privatization process is having on the Greek people, insights into the negotiation process that he held with the Troika as finance minister in 2015, and whether he thinks capitalism is reformable. I want to talk about privatization. In December 2015, a German airport operator called Fraport won the bid to operate and maintain 14 regional airports in Greece. According to the website, Lufthansa owns around 8.45% shares in Fraport. Specifically about privatization, have the Greek people benefited from it?
I keep an open mind on privatization. When people ask me, are you in favor or against? My answer is it depends. Which privatization and under what conditions and circumstances? So when it came to the privatization of, let's say, a telecom company, the Greek telecom company, I don't think that was a bad idea. But if you ask me about the privatization of the electricity grid, I'm dead against it because it never works. Whenever you privatize such a natural monopoly, the result is inefficiency and corruption. California style, for instance, right? On the question of the Greek regional airports, even if you're a neoliberal who believes in privatization, you should question the sale of all 14 regional airports to one company. Supposedly, I mean, when Margaret Thatcher introduced privatization on a neoliberal agenda that I fought against, I used to live in Britain then, I used to demonstrate against Mrs. Thatcher's policies, but I don't believe that Mrs. Thatcher would ever consider selling all airports to one company, because the point of privatization was to bring competition into the market. There's no competition there when one company buys all the airports. So I'm afraid that the fact that the Greek government, actually no Greek government since 2010, has owned its economic and social reform policy agenda leads to colonial type deals, which in the end do not benefit the economy and make the people of the country feel that effectively they are being abused and exploited. And this is never a good feeling to have when you want to reform a country.
Let's move on to some topics that I think require more scrutiny. Wolfgang Schäuble, followed by the media here, made a big fuss about Greece's moral obligation to pay its debt. The media here in Germany hasn't made much fuss about the moral obligation to end the suffering of the Greek people. I want to test the Memorandum of Understanding and its compatibility with the Declaration of Human Rights. And I've picked 2 articles from the Declaration, and let's go through them together, and I want to know your opinions about them, whether they're compatible or not. Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and shall act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Your opinion?
Well, it's a very fine piece of text, but it is not particularly pertinent when it comes to the policies of the Eurogroup and the Troika, as anyone who's experienced those machinations knows. But let me make a very simple point. Capitalism only flourished when moralizing about debt ended. Let me remind you that there used to be debt prisons in the 19th century. If you were a businessman and you lost your capacity to repay your debt, you ended up in debt prison. Effectively, you were finished as a human being. You lost your human rights, your dignity. Capitalism only took off when the concept of limited liability was introduced. You can start a business, you can fail, but that doesn't mean that your kids are going to end up in a debt prison. When we are bringing a moralizing agenda back into the midst of a crisis like the one we're having in the Eurozone, what we're doing is we're undermining the very principle of capitalism, and it takes a left-winger in order to say that. So even if you are a liberal who believes in the market's capacity to bring about a miracle of growth and stability and so on and so forth, this kind of moralizing and finger-pointing is not helpful and must end. And let's not forget that Germany was given an opportunity to pick itself up from the bootstraps in 1953, only due to the Americans' insistence that the London Conference in 1953 should write off more than 60% of German debt in order to allow this country to fulfill the speech of hope that Secretary Barnes issued in Stuttgart. If we condemn a whole generation to permanent poverty because of debts that should never have been accumulated, we are doing a major disservice to Europe.
Let's talk about the media for a second. You have been invited to England by the Labour Party for a series of talks. Jeremy Corbyn, a socialist, was elected to leadership several months ago. The media in England has been quite ferocious in its attacks, and even The Guardian had negative opinions about you, calling you anti-EU. From your experience, do you have any thoughts on how the left can defend itself against these sort of attacks from the centrist media as well as the right-wing press?
Ignore them and articulate reasonable, rational policies which eventually, through the strength of their rationality and pertinence, manage to push through the barriers of distortion of the media and touch the minds and the hearts of the audience. Disintermediation is the name of the game. That is, speak directly to the public, bypassing the media, and then the media will shift their position too.
Also, what's very rarely known or talked about is the entire atmosphere in doing the negotiation process, what politicians go through, how much time, deadlines, and so forth and so on. So James Galbraith mentioned that it was quite chaotic, the entire negotiations in the European Union, and also that our reporter from Greece reported that there was never enough time for politicians that came back, Greek politicians that came back, to have a meaningful debate presented to the public whenever some new proposal came. Could you talk about your experience in these negotiation processes?
It's worse than that.
It's worse than that.
It's worse than that. Because as Henry Kissinger said once, when I want to talk, he said to the leaders of Europe, I don't know whom to talk to. Who do I call? I don't have a telephone number. That was the feeling that I was getting. We were negotiating, supposedly, with Europe. But Europe appeared to us as a troika, 3 institutions. Now, each one of them had its own agenda. And those agendas were clashing against one another. So the IMF, for instance, the International Monetary Fund, was very sympathetic to our position that the first part of the deal should be debt relief in order to be able to stabilize the macroeconomy and to render the Greek economy and the Greek society reformable. The Commission, fearing the position of several finance ministers who were adamant that there should be no debt relief, blocked that. The European Central Bank had its own agenda. Within the institutions, you talk to the head of the Commission, you got one view. You talk to somebody lower down the food chain within the Commission, you got a completely different view. So you can imagine how frustrating it is when you don't know who to negotiate with. The other side is fragmented both vertically within the institutions and horizontally across the institutions. And let me say something that may strike our audience particularly in terms of its weirdness, but it's completely true. We never had any proposals from the outside. You mentioned that we didn't have the time to go back and debate the proposals we had with Parliament, with Cabinet, with society at large. We never had any proposals from them until the 25th of June when we got an ultimatum. During the period of negotiations between January and June, it was a merry-go-round. We were being asked what our policy was on privatization. We would present our policy on privatization. They would disagree, and then they say, yes, but what about VAT? Then we would talk about value-added tax, VAT. They would reject our proposal. They wouldn't give us a proposal.
And you even proposed 500 tax advisors from Germany, if I'm correct.
We proposed all sorts of things. I even proposed a debt break, which is a very German thing, and it was ignored. Look, let's be clear about this. There was never an intention by the other side to reach an honorable agreement with us. The only objective was to humiliate a government that dared say to their face that the program that the Troika had been implementing for the last 5 years in Greece had failed. It's as simple as that. It was naked power politics of the 19th century type.
So to my last question, and I want to try to see what we think is the fundamental of the crisis, part of the fundamentals. There's a YouTube video of a lecture by Vivek Chibar, professor of sociology and politics, that has been floating around since 2007. In it, he talks about how the state has built-in structural bias against labor and in favor of capital. He mentions that even when left-wing parties achieve power, the first thing that they do is go to the investors before even considering the needs of the voters. That if investors are not satisfied with election outcomes and party mandates, they may take action in the form of an investment strike, thereby starving the state of badly needed funds for government programs. Eventually, the same people who voted for a left party go and vote for another party, basically vote them out. What do you make of this argument? And do you think the reform approach can work without massive mobilization? That's the first part. And are we doomed to be forever locked in a battle with capital, or is there an alternative?
Well, you're talking to a left-winger, so it's quite predictable what I'm going to say. Of course, this is not a level playing field. If you have an agenda in favor of redistributing from profits to wages, if you have an agenda for taxing the top 0.1% in order to bolster low pensions, you have an uphill battle, because there is a triangle of sin, as I call it, that is going to oppose you tooth and nail, which is perfectly normal and perfectly natural. And that triangle comprises the media owners, the banking establishment, the financial sector, and those who have a very cozy relationship with the state in terms of procurement, development, and so on and so forth. But at least you have a chance in places like the United Kingdom, like in India, like in the United States, even, in Canada. In Europe, things are far, far, far worse. And the reason they are far worse is because we don't have a parliament which is capable of keeping checks and balances on the executive. So there is a policy on labor markets. There is a policy on fiscal matters. There's a policy on monetary policy. But there is no parliament which can, even theoretically, say to those who are in control of this policy, you know what, you're fired. In the United States, there is a Congress. In Britain, there is the House of Commons. Even the House of Lords has a capacity to impose certain constraints on George Osborne, for instance. In Europe, we have the European Parliament that, by definition and design, cannot legislate. So we have the Eurogroup, which passes all these decisions regarding, for instance, labor markets in Greece. But there is no parliament that can dismiss the Eurogroup. The fact that the Greek finance minister or the German finance minister can be fired by the Greek or the German parliament is neither here nor there. Because the Greek member of the Eurogroup goes to the Greek parliament and says, I disagreed with what the Eurogroup did. And maybe he did, or she did. So we have a fundamental lack of liberal democracy, even bourgeois capitalist liberal democracy. So the struggle for looking after the weak in a place like the Eurozone is infinitely more difficult than it is in the United States or in Britain.
Yanis Varoufakis, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that is all from the team in Munich. Please tune in on www.acTVism.org. Thank you for joining us.
Well, democracy is necessary because without it, you end up with exceptionally bad economic policies, which are responsible for the fact that the European Union is the sick patient of the global economy. It's the reason why, of all the regions around the world, Europe has done the worst since the financial crisis in 2008. It's because of lack of democracy. Let me put it very simply. If in the United States, the economic outcomes were so bad as they are here, if they still had 11-12% average unemployment rate, the government would have fallen, the bureaucrats would have been fired. Here, they can keep making one mistake after the other. It's a comedy of errors. it's a debacle, they're incompetent, and yet nobody can fire them. So they keep doing the same thing again and again. You ask me what democracy is. Let me say something very simple. In democracies, the people have the right to ask 4 questions of the people that make the decisions on their behalf. The important decisions. I'm not talking about who's going to gather the garbage. These are important decisions too, but I'm talking about the decisions about our money, about our working conditions, about our environment, about our welfare state. We should be able to ask them 4 questions. Firstly, what powers do you have? Define them. Tell us exactly what. In Europe you can't, because they make them up as they're going along. Secondly, who gave you those powers? They can't tell you. For instance, did you know that most of your policies are being dictated by something called the Euro Working Group, chaired by a certain Mr. Thomas Wieser, who has more power than most of your government ministers? Thirdly, how do you use your powers? What exactly do you do? All the decisions are made behind closed doors. You don't even know what the decisions are, especially in the periphery of Europe, ruled by a totally opaque troika. And finally, how can we get rid of you? If you can't ask rulers, how can we get rid of you and get an answer? Which we can't here, because the Euro Working Group you cannot get rid of. The Eurogroup you can't get rid of, because as a group it makes all the important decisions, but there is no body like a parliament that can get rid of them. In the Federal Republic, the government can be gotten rid of by the Bundestag. In Europe, there is no such mechanism at all. So there is no democratic deficit in the European Union. It's not that the European Union is not sufficiently democratic. Imagine for a moment that you have a man or a woman on the moon in a space suit, and they take the helmet off and say, oh, there is an air deficit. There's no deficit. There's no air. Similarly, in the European Union, there is no democracy. There is indeed the opposite, contempt for democracy. Democracy is used as a fig leaf in order to legitimize what they're doing. And so why do we need democracy? The reason why we had democracy in Germany, in Britain, in Greece, in the United States, was because capitalism without democracy is a very uncivilized system in which life is nasty, brutish, and short. Well, for a start, it would be nice if we actually constrain them, put some limitations to them, like, for instance, make them pay tax, stop this regime of the race to the bottom, where they can go to Ireland and pay 12% corporation tax in order to avoid the German tax. Then even that they don't pay because they have a deal with the Netherlands, where the money goes, and before it goes to the Caribbean, and then they end up paying 1%. So how about, before we democratize them, make them pay where they sell? Well, firstly, what is the first? You always need to walk before you run. You need to take one step before you get anywhere. So what's the first step that we can take at zero cost tomorrow morning? Well, transparency. How about live streaming all the important meetings of the Eurogroup, of the ECOFIN, of the European Council meeting, so that you and I can see and hear what our representatives are saying on our behalf. That we can do, as I said, at zero cost tomorrow. You don't need to change the treaties, you don't need to have a discussion about financing. And I would very much like to hear Mr. Tusk, Mr. Dijsselbloem, the head of the European Central Bank, explain to me why they don't want this. It would be very nice to have their views as to why the European citizens that are sending them there do not have the right to know. At the moment, they never know. No minutes are taken. Remember, I was being accused of taping the Eurogroup meetings. It was my duty to tape them. And it is our duty as Europeans to push our institutions towards more transparency. So without transparency, you have no democracy. Because if citizens don't know what the government is doing on their behalf, they cannot pass critical judgment on it. So, okay, so that's the first point. The second point is we have a terrible economic crisis, which is affecting all of us in different ways. So in Germany, you have pension funds being crushed by negative interest rates. So savers are up in arms, rightly so, because the ECB is buying lots of bonds, so there's a scarcity. Anyway, there's a long story as to why this is happening, but
one of the outcomes of the crisis. In Greece, we have a Great Depression. We have a crashed social economy. In Spain, in Portugal, in Ireland, you have deflation. So these are the different, if you want, manifestations of the same crisis. We're not dealing with it. We're not dealing with it. There's never been, I was minister for 6 months, that wasn't very long. I can assure you there wasn't a single discussion about how to deal with this. So this is the second, our, if you want, more medium-term goal, to redeploy existing institutions, and it can be done. Technically, it's not difficult. The problem is we don't have a discussion. We don't have a forum in which the European Parliament is not a parliament. What parliament do you know in the world, or in the history of liberal democracies, that cannot legislate? Look, you cannot really democratize a central bank. The central bank must be quite technical, but what you can do is you can make it more transparent. So the Federal Reserve in the United States has to do two things that the ECB doesn't have to do. The first one is go to Congress every 6 months and report on its effect on unemployment. The ECB never does that. And there is no Congress to go to. The European Parliament, as I said, is not a real parliament. It's a pretend parliament. And the second thing it needs to do, it needs to publish its minutes. So when these people get around to discuss what they will do about monetary policy in America, they have to actually take minutes, and after a few weeks, they have to publish them so the public knows who said what and who proposed which change in interest rates and why. Wouldn't that be nice to have? This is not a radical left proposal. This is the Federal Reserve. This is what the Bank of England does. Europe, we are not doing it, and nobody knows that we're not doing it. This is a terrible thing. So there are very clear ways in which we can redeploy. So the ECB, instead of buying bonds, which is depressing the pension funds, could be buying European Investment Bank bonds to finance a Green New Deal for Europe. Why are we not doing it? Why is there no discussion of this? Because we don't have a democratic process where we can call into account those who do not have this discussion. Do we have a constitution in Europe? No. We have a single market, we have a single currency, but we don't have a constitution. Now, people died in America, in France, in Germany, in Greece. Syntagma Square, where all the demonstrations happen in Greece, Syntagma means constitution, Constitution Square. Why? Because people died there demonstrating for the lack of a constitution. Without a constitution, we don't have an established pattern of rules. We have all these treaties that are self-cancelling, that are impossible to read. Take the treaties under which the EU operates and read them. They are unreadable. From a literature point of view, it's just impossible. It's like reading the telephone book. Yeah? Take the American Constitution and read it. It's beautiful. This is where the Americans feel an identity, because there is a document which they can be proud of. I may disagree with the American Constitution, but let's have one that we disagree on, but nevertheless one that we have collectively decided upon. There was an attempt to write supposedly a constitution for the European Union by Giscard d'Estaing, and it began with the rights of capital. No, read the preamble to the American Constitution. It's about the rights of men and women. Yeah? So without a constitution, we can't have a single market that actually functions and which creates economic outcomes which are consistent with shared prosperity and a shared democracy. It's not a forecast, it's an observation. Look at it, it's happening. You want to see what's happening to Schengen? It's collapsing. When I hear responsible politicians saying that Turkey should open its borders to the Aleppo refugees from Syria, but Greece should close down its border with Turkey, I think, oh my God, what has happened to Europe? What do they want to do? They want the Greek Navy to shoot refugees when they're coming in? Or do they want to turn a member state of the European Union into a concentration camp for refugees because we don't want them to go to Paris? This is simply the sights and sounds of a disintegrating European Union. On the economic front, I could mention many fronts. If I were to, let's say I were to give you 10 million euros as a present, and I gave you an option of having them in a Frankfurt bank account or in a Portuguese bank account, would you have a preference? I bet you would. You would want them in Frankfurt. They would be safer. In the United States, or in Britain, if you give somebody $10 million or 10 million pounds, they don't care which bank account they put it in, because they're worth the same, because they have a genuine banking union. We don't have a banking union. And the worst thing is that our politicians are calling something a banking union, which is not a banking union. So we have subterfuge. We have a campaign of disinformation about what we're doing, Orwellian. We take a disunion in banks and we call it union. And people out there think, okay, now we have a banking union. They don't. So this is the disintegration in real time in front of us. And what DiEM is about is trying to get people together throughout Europe, independently of our nationality, political party affiliation, and say, folks, we have a serious problem here. Do we want to do something about this? Or are we going to be answerable to history? In 10, 20 years' time, our children say to us, why didn't you do something to stop, to prevent this disintegration?
Good evening. We don't have anyone to introduce us, so I've been asked to kick off by saying, firstly, that isn't this wonderful that we're all here just to subvert the notion that nothing good can come out of the public sector? No.
Well, the fact that I'm here barely actually has a relationship to that comment. I came from Boston. My wife and I came from Boston. Took 7 hours. And any society that hasn't been smashed by neoliberal policies of the kind you describe, it would have taken maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours. There is a train, the pride of the public sector, which I took for the first time in 1950, and it's about 15 minutes faster now than it was then when it makes the schedule, which is a chancy situation. So we decided to come by airplane and spent most of the afternoon on the runway.
Well, Noam, what shall we talk about?
Well, we can talk about the neoliberal assault on the world's population in the last generation, which you've written so brilliantly about.
What strikes me, given the last quite eventful year of my life, what really strikes me is the major disconnect between the philosophy and ideology of neoliberalism and that which I encountered when negotiating, in inverted commas negotiating, when being dictated by the great and the good of the neoliberal international financial establishment. Now, think about it. If you take the great libertarians, the great neoliberals, who castigate all tax-funded activities, and you consider the reason why I'm here today and I'm not still the Minister of Finance of Greece. Why? It's because I refuse another 100 billion smackers, dollars, of a tax-backed loan to my insolvent government, which the creditors insisted that I should take.
The three nines.
It's astonishing. So here it is. So here you have the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission insisting that our bankrupt state takes on another 100 billion under conditions that guarantee that we will not be able to repay the taxpayers of Europe that will be granting us that money. And that comes from neoliberals, who supposedly are against all tax-funded loans to government, and who supposedly believe that an insolvent entity doesn't have the moral right to take on more loans.
But as you point out, what is it, 90% of those loans go to French and German bankers.
That was the first loan. This loan, it would go from the one pocket of the creditors to another pocket of the creditors, so that they would maintain the pretense that Greece was not bankrupt. But effectively, what I'm trying to say is the intense hypocrisy of the neoliberal establishment, which is not really even interested in sticking to its own neoliberal ideology. This is just 19th century power politics of crushing anyone who dares stand up to them and say a simple word, no.
But I think that's actually traditional. One of the paradoxes of neoliberalism is that it's not new and it's not liberal.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
If you look at what you describe is a form of hypocrisy, but the same is true of saying that we should not support tax-funded institutions. The financial sector is basically tax-funded.
Of course.
You recall the IMF study of the leading American banks, which determined that virtually all their profits come from their implicit government insurance policy, cheap credit, access to higher credit ratings, incentives to take risky transactions which are profitable, but then if it's problematic, you guys pay for it. Or just take the basis of the contemporary economy, which actually I've been privileged to see developing in government subsidized laboratories for decades. MIT, where I've been since the 1950s, is one of the institutions where the government, the funnel in the early days was the Pentagon, was pouring in money to create the basis for the high-tech economy of the future and the profit-making of the institutions that are regarded as private enterprises. It was decades of work under public funding with a very anti-capitalist ideology. So according to capitalist principles, if someone invests in a risky enterprise over a long period and 30 years later it makes them profit, they're supposed to get part of the profit. But it doesn't work like that here. It was the taxpayer who invested for decades. The profit goes to Apple and Microsoft, not to the taxpayer.
Indeed. If you take an iPhone apart, every single technology in it was developed by some government grant.
And for
every single one.
And for long
And some
period.
of them by government grants from other countries,
Yeah.
like Wi-Fi from the Australian
And
Commonwealth.
you see an interesting picture of it from a place like MIT or other major research institutions. So if you walked around the building where I work 50 years ago, you would have seen electronic firms, Raytheon, iTech, others, IBM, there to essentially rob the technology that's being developed at public expense and seeing if they can turn it into something applicable for profits. You walk around the institution today, you see different buildings. You see Novartis, Pfizer, big pharmaceutical corporations. Why? Because the cutting edge of the economy has shifted from electronics-based to biology-based. So therefore, the predators in the so-called private sector are there to see what they can pick up from the taxpayer-funded research in fundamental biological sciences. And that's called free enterprise and a free market system. So speak of hypocrisy, pretty hard to go beyond that.
Quite right. This hypocrisy is fundamental to the whole enterprise culture of capitalism from
the
250 years ago. I mean, the whole notion that there can be a market system which is at an arm's length separated from a state which is the enemy is the sickest joke in the history of humankind. If you think that, I mean, this narrative of private wealth creation, which is appropriated by the big bad wolf, the state, on behalf of trades unions and the working class that need a social welfare net, is just a preposterous reversal of the truth. That wealth is being created collectively and appropriated privately. But right from the beginning, I mean, the enclosures in Britain would never have happened without the king's army.
That's
and without state brutality for pushing peasants off their ancestors' land and creating the commodification of labor, the commodification of land, which then gave rise to capitalism. Just half an hour ago, we were being shown, some of us, the magnificent collection of maps of the city of New York in this wonderful building. And you could see in one of the maps of Alabama the precise depiction of the theft of land from Native Americans, the way in which it was parceled up, commodified. Now, that would never have happened without the brutal intervention of the state, which created the process of privatization of land and therefore of commodification.
Actually, one of my favorite passages from Adam Smith is where he gives advice to the new colonies, to newly liberated colonies, as to how they should pursue sound economics, which is pretty much what the IMF tells the third world today. What he said is the advice was you should concentrate on what was later called comparative advantage, produce agricultural products, you're good at that, export furs, fish, and so on. But don't try to produce manufacturing goods, because Britain, England, has superior manufacturing goods. So therefore you should import them from England. They're good at that, you're good at cotton and corn. Incidentally, the cotton was hardly by free enterprise. And you should certainly not try to monopolize the resources that you have. And if you pursue those practices, then everybody will be better off. Economic theory proves that. Well, the United States happened to be free of English control. So therefore they were able to do the opposite, just as England had done. High tariffs to block British goods, enabled them to create a textile industry, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, later in the century a steel industry, blocking superior British steel, and right up to the present, as I've mentioned, with high tech. As far as monopolization is concerned, the U.S. made a major effort to monopolize the basic resource for the early Industrial Revolution, namely cotton. That's the oil of the 19th century. And the U.S. had most of it, not all of it. And the conquest of Mexico, which was not exactly by free enterprise, was largely undertaken to try to gain a monopoly of cotton, which would overcome the major enemy in those days, which was Britain. Britain was the big force, the enemy. And the Jacksonian presidents, Tyler, Peirce, mid-19th century, their position was that if we could monopolize cotton, we could bring England to our feet. That way we could really defeat them. They didn't quite make it, but made a lot. Incidentally, that effort was what Saddam Hussein was charged with in 1990. The charge was ludicrous, but the charge was he was going to try to monopolize oil and bring us all to his feet, which was crazy. but the U.S. did try to monopolize cotton, and that's part of the way in which power shifted from England to the United States. I think that's a pretty good record of the way sound economics has worked over the years. There have been places where sound economics was applied, liberal policies. It's called the Third World. And it's not an accident. You take a look at the global South. One country developed, Japan, the one country that was not colonized. Take a look at East Asia, the tigers of East Asia. The one exception, the one that was conquered by the United States, 1898, with a couple 100,000 people killed and stays semi-colonized, not part of the Asian tiger explosion of industrialization. The pattern is just uniform, but somehow hasn't entered economic theory. Wonder why. You're an economist. There have been places where sound economics was applied, liberal policies. It's called the Third World. And it's not an accident. You take a look at the global South. One country developed, Japan, the one country that was not colonized. Take a look at East Asia, the tigers of East Asia. The one exception, the one that was conquered by the United States, 1898, with a couple 100,000 people killed and stays semi-colonized, not part of the Asian tiger explosion of industrialization. The pattern is just uniform, but somehow hasn't entered economic theory. Wonder why. You're an economist.
Well, the reason why it never entered economic theory was because economics in universities began to evolve from the 1950s onwards as the queen of the social sciences. And what gave discursive power and monopoly power within the academic environment to economics was the claim that it was the only social theory which was peddling universal truths to be proven by mathematical means. And it succeeded. So when a sociologist, an anthropologist, and an economist applied for a grant, it was always the economist who got it on the basis of this discursive monopoly. And however, in order to close the model mathematically, the only way to solve the equations is by making assumptions that distance the model from really existing capitalism. So, for instance, you have to assume that there's no time and there's no space. Because if you allow time to interfere with your model or space to enter, you end up with indeterminacy. In other words, you end up with a system of equations that cannot be solved or that have an infinity of possible solutions, and then you have no predictive power. Yeah. You can't say, well, this is what's going to happen. So we have a very interesting inverse Darwinian process. The more successful economists were at creating models that said precisely nothing about capitalism, the greater their success in the academy. So they became the opposite of the public intellectuals that you've been writing about. They create wonderful abstractions, aesthetically pleasing models that I spent quite a few years studying, in the same way that you go to a museum and you look at a piece of abstract art, but you don't expect to find the truth of capitalism in its form. So this is the interesting sociology of knowledge within the economics profession. But then there is a parallel shift, the end of Bretton Woods, which unleashed banking. Remember, Roosevelt made sure that in the Bretton Woods Conference, which designed the post-war, the first post-war phase between the 1940s and 1971, 1973, he had stipulated that one kind of person should not be allowed into the Bretton Woods Conference. You know who these people were? Bankers. Not one banker attended the Bretton Woods conference. And that was at the explicit order of FDR.
And it showed.
And so you had boring banks between 1944 and 1971. But after 1971, and we can discuss why that is, suddenly banking was unleashed, and their capacity effectively to mint private money became unlimited and essential to the second post-war phase of global capitalism, of American hegemony. During this unleashing, there was a need for a theoretical and ideological cover. So I don't blame my fellow economists for pulling the trigger that created so much devastation in 2008 and before that and after that, but I blame them for providing the mathematical models, the sermons, which steadied the hand of the financiers and allowed them to believe that what they were doing was perfectly okay, consistent with science, provable mathematically that it was riskless, and therefore allowed them the mental and emotional strength to do a lot more damage than they would have done otherwise.
Actually, one of the more interesting moments in the history of science and scholarship was actually in 2008. As you know, for decades, economists had been claiming with extreme arrogance that they completely understood how to control and manage an economy. There were fundamental principles like the efficient market hypothesis, rational expectations, and anyone who didn't accept this was dismissed as a kind of some strange kind of moron. The whole system collapsed. The whole intellectual edifice collapsed in a most amazing fashion and had no effect on the profession.
None at all. Well, it did have. It had the effect that sometimes, you know, when we're driving on a freeway, and I usually go well above the speed limit, condemned if you will, and I get stopped by the police, for the next 20 minutes I drive below the speed limit, but it doesn't last for more than 20 minutes. Then after a while I just go back to where I was. This is exactly like the economics profession. They had a brief moment of...
some did, but...
Some. Or at least of being a bit humble and staying, you know, keeping their heads under the parapet for a bit. But then within 20 minutes they forgot about it and they carried on teaching the same rubbish to their students. But what is interesting, Noam, is that two small points. It's not that the economists went headlong into this mathematized religion, because that's what it is. It's a religion with equations and with a bit of bad statistics. What happened was two things. Firstly, there was a kind of ethnic cleansing of anybody that had retained their wits about the economy. So there were economists who challenged this view and who were simply not reproduced by the system. They never got the grants, they never got the PhD students, their PhD students never got lectureships, never got assistant professorships. So there was a purge of the establishment. The second, which is a far more interesting phenomenon, is that the wonderful minds that created the general equilibrium models, the highest, the popes of the Catholic Church, were not believers. So take, for instance, Ken Arrow. Ken Arrow is, and Gerard Debreu. They're the ones that John Nash, they established the mathematical theorems upon which all this hypocrisy is based. Now, these people, Ken Arrow, I remember in the early 1990s, he was giving a talk at NYU. And there were about 20 people. It was a highly mathematized paper. Okay, so he was enthusiastically going through the equations, and one of the professors there interrupted him at some point and said, "Professor Arrow, equation 3.3 reminds me of the argument in favor of this kind of tax as opposed to that kind of tax." And Ken stopped him immediately and said, "My dear boy," he was a bit condescending, I think rightly so, he said, "you're confusing that which is interesting with that which is useful. This is interesting. If you try to apply to anything real, it's dangerous." So the gurus, the popes, understood that this theory was examining a post-capitalist world, a world without labor markets, without labor exploitation, without monopolies, without even the slightest of capacities to alter prices on the behalf of employers, of entrepreneurs, of conglomerates, a world without firms. Because what is a company? A company is a market-free zone. It's a hierarchy. It's a small Soviet Union with Gosplan and central planning. If you look at Google, if you look at Microsoft, that's what it is.
Then you have Coase's theorem. That's a big help.
Yes, yes. But the Coase's theorem is taught for 5 seconds and then forgotten.
Yeah.
Yeah? In order to make them feel that they've said something about the reason why firms exist.
Yeah.
But then in those models that produce the macroeconomic policies that were applied even under Clinton, especially under Clinton, there are no firms. There's no time, no firms, no space. Everybody resides on the same point in space so that there are no costs of transport or anything like that. So imagine a world in which economic policy is predicated upon models that assume there is no time, space, firms, profit, or economic rent.
Or monopolies.
It's time to get really scared.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's wonderful to be here because basic income is a necessity. I'm going to actually argue that this is not a question of whether we like it or not. It will be a major part of any attempt to civilize capitalism, as capitalism is going through a spasm caused by its own generation of technologies that undermine itself. To put it simply, in the 20th century, we had the stabilization and civilization of capitalism through the rise of social democracy. The New Deal in the United States, the social democratic social market developments in Europe. Unfortunately, this social democratic New Deal paradigm is finished, and it cannot be revived. I shall make some comments on this. But first, let us remind ourselves of what the social democratic New Deal tradition is all about. It's about 2 things. Firstly, redistribution of income within waged labor, a kind of insurance for the working class insuring the working class. Take, for instance, the National Insurance Contribution Scheme in Britain after the Second World War, unemployment insurance in the United States, working waged laborers effectively providing insurance payments to those out of a job. Same with health provision, pensions, those working today providing for the pensions of those who have stopped working. So insurance and redistribution within the working class, to put it very bluntly. The second dimension, of course, is redistribution between capital and labor, between rents and labor. This takes the form of minimum wages that are negotiated by the state. It's also a process of collective bargaining, usually triangular, involving trades unions, employers, and the state. And of course, taxation, transfers through the taxation system. Now, this social democratic tradition, I made a very big statement a moment ago, didn't I? Is dead in the water. And it is dead in the water or dying in the water for 2 reasons. For reasons that have to do with 2 earthquakes that have hit our societies on both sides of the Atlantic. One is the process of financialization, which created a huge wedge between capital and labor. It created a new form of capital, financialized capital, that essentially depleted the energy of both labor and of industrial capital. And this inexorable financialization drive had its comeuppance in 2008. And ever since, you remember after 1991, socialism died with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then after 2008, capitalism died. We have a new regime now. I call it bankruptocracy. It's ruled by the bankrupt banks. The more bankrupt the bank, the greater its capacity to mobilize and usurp economic rents and economic value from the rest of society, including industrial capital and labor. And the problem with bankruptocracy, the fact that for 6 years now, we have a cynical, massive transfer of wealth, of income, of value, from production towards the financialized financial sector that remains insolvent in reality, despite this cynical transfer. The problem with this is that it has created two things. Firstly, deflationary forces. Ask anyone working in the Central Bank of Switzerland today, or in the Bundesbank, or in the European Central Bank, or the Bank of Japan, or the Bank of England, or the Fed. They can't sleep at night because of the fact that about half of the global economy now is languishing in negative interest rate territory. And this is a reflection of the collapse of the social democratic New Deal bargain contract, social contract, if you want, of the 20th century. And that collapse happened in 2008. The world after 2008 cannot be understood anymore in terms that made sense before 2008. Just like the world after 1929 could not be made sense of in terms that make sense in the gold exchange standard era prior to 1929. The second reason, with the deflationary process, we have now the first plank of the social democratic tradition is dead in the water because the working class can no longer insure itself. It's stagnant wages, the fact that youngsters are caught up in a dual labor market and they find it very difficult. I'm not talking about Switzerland, of course, now, but I'm talking about the rest of the developed world. Switzerland is successful only because it's only one of them, and nobody else can be like Switzerland. But that's another discussion. We can have it later if you want. The fact remains that the first plank, the insurance amongst wage laborers, is simply not possible because wages have stagnated to such an extent that it is impossible for the working class to insure itself. And the second plank, the redistribution between capital and labor, is becoming increasingly impossible for two reasons. First, the politics that has become quite toxic. Just look at what's happening in the negotiations between Greece and the Troika within the European Union at the moment. In the United States, where you've got a Congress vetoing the White House and a White House vetoing the Congress, this redistribution between capital and labor that was part and parcel of the New Deal and social democracy required political governance. Europe and the United States are ungovernable as we speak. Utterly, completely ungovernable. And so that's the first earthquake. The second earthquake has to do, this is nothing new, I'm sure it has been discussed already today, I caught glimpses of this discussion. Let me put it very bluntly in science fiction terms, the rise of the machines. Artificial intelligence will consume very, very soon, it's already doing it, all repetitive, routine work or algorithmic work is going to be replaced, especially the moment machines pass the Turing test, and it is impossible for you and I to understand when we speak to somebody on the phone whether we're speaking to a machine or to a human person. Once we have that, we're going to have a massive displacement effect, which for the first time in human history, in capitalist history, is going to overwhelm the creation effect. More job destruction than job creation. Because remember that the bankruptocracy that I have referred to came at the tail end of a 30-year period of replacement of manufacturing jobs in the developing world with low-wage, repetitive work. Employment rates, for instance, in Britain, since the previous speaker comes from Britain, employment rates are quite high in Britain, and they're quite high in the United States. But the bulk of those jobs that were created to replace the jobs that were lost after 2008, after 1975 and 1983, are low-waged, routine jobs, the ones that will be culled immediately the moment artificial intelligence overcomes the Turing test. And we are facing a major issue there. To link it with what I was saying before, this displacement is going to reinforce the deflationary processes that keep our central bankers awake at night, because it will eliminate a significant measure of aggregate demand.
It will create an even greater level of income inequality and primarily disparity between savings and investment. And this disparity between savings and investment will force the price of money, the rate of interest, even below the current low levels. So this is why I'm saying that basic income is going to be an essential part, a necessary part of any attempt to stabilize society and to civilize it. I don't need to define basic income. Let me just say that the struggle we are going to have to carry hearts and minds will be an ethical one. And an ethical one that doesn't simply spring out of opposition from the haves, but also from opposition from the have-nots, from social democrats, from leftists, from those whose own sense of dignity responds against, naturally, the idea of something for nothing. This is why it's important to couch basic income as what it is. It is the idea that, and allow me to narrate it in broad terms, we are going to overturn the current narrative on life under capitalism. The current narrative, the dominant paradigm, is what? That we have private production of wealth, which is then appropriated by the state for social purposes. In reality, our wealth production is collective, it is social, and it is only then privately appropriated. Unless we make this shift in the narrative, we're not going to be able to succeed to convince even those who will benefit from basic income that it is worthwhile struggling for it. Take an iPhone, unpick it, open it. What do you find in it? You find a variety of technologies. Each one of them was created by some government grant. None of them was produced by Apple, none of them was produced by Google, none of them was produced by Facebook. They were all produced by some government grant. This is what I'm saying about, this is why I'm referring to the collective production of wealth, which is then privately appropriated. If you start thinking of it that way, then it's very easy to start thinking of basic income as a dividend that goes to the collective that was responsible for collectively producing the wealth, and the gadgets, and the products, and the markets. Because this false separation, illusory separation between the market and the state needs to be dissolved. There would have been no markets if there were no states. There would have been no capitalism if there was not a state. There would be no Apple, no Google if there was no state. And similarly, there would be no state if there were no private entrepreneurs. There would be no state if there were no private firms. We need to dissolve this false division. And we have to attack the narrative head-on. Basic income is about giving money to the undeserving. It is about giving money to the rich. It is about giving money to the surfers, the beach bums, the ones that we dislike, the ones that we would not like to be our children, and who, if they were our children, we will be scolding them. So we must not be sidetracked by simply talking about good people getting money that they deserve. We should talk about undeserving people that get money courtesy of the fact that they are members of a society that is collectively producing wealth. And then, on top of this, we need to add the narrative of stabilization. Think about it. In Europe today, in the United States today, basic income would really help central bankers go to sleep at night. It will be counter-deflationary. It will be a unique defense against the slow-burning recessionary impact of 2008. Now, there are decent arguments against basic income that we must not avoid. Somebody may say to you, yes, but the rich do not need a basic income. Well, sure, but they don't need to have the first 10,000 Swiss francs that they make being tax exempt either. And nobody is worried about that. Surely, we hear being said, it's better to target the money that society has on those who are deserving. Well, yes, but you have to think of the other side of the story too. To separate the deserving from the undeserving, you need a bureaucracy whose purpose is to do that. That bureaucracy tends to replicate itself. Bureaucrats love to reproduce themselves and to reproduce their power over society, and to do so by creating a stigma attached to those whom they consider to be undeserving. It is very similar to psychiatry. The moment you introduce psychiatry, remember Michel Foucault and the story about the madhouse, you create a narrative of reason and unreason, you create a power structure. The person who has the certificate to be the psychiatrist decides who is sane and who has the right to be a free citizen. The other argument, which I think is also one that needs to be confronted, is that people should have a right to a job, not a right to basic income, and that we should be promoting work, not sloth. Well, I think that there are 2 points here that need to be made. Well, firstly, nothing stops us as a society from censuring those who are idle. Why should we have them starve? I know that if my kids were idle, I would be censuring them, but I would not be throwing them out of the house. Secondly, and more importantly, the right to turn down a job is essential for a well-functioning labor market and for a civilized society. And to have the right, a genuine right to turn down a job, you must have an alternative, an outside option. Because desperate people will accept to do desperate things. I heard somebody here today earlier talking about a cleaner whose job is not respected, whose name is not known. I have a story to tell you about that. I've worked in a number of universities, and I remember in the old days, we had cleaners that worked for the university. And they were like my boss in the department. You know, they would come into my office and they would know about my family, they would know about my wife, they would know about me, they would tell me off, they would say, it's 8 o'clock at night, go to your wife, what are you doing? Yeah? And they had a sense of belonging to an institution and being institutionally important. And then what happened? We subcontracted all the labor to firms that hire by night people that are faceless, who are turned over all the time, who are paid less, who are not institutionally connected to the place, whether this is the university, the National Gallery in London, and so on and so forth. But why did this process spin out of control? It did because the cleaners had no outside option. No right to say no to the subcontracted contract. Now, just so that we do not face only the negative arguments, let me just, before I conclude and we open this up to discussion, let me mention what I think are essential aspects from a social perspective, not just from a macroeconomic perspective. It is important to state the macroeconomic case for basic income, for stabilizing the financial markets, investment, overall aggregate demand. But there are others at the level of the micro and the sociological. Social democracy put forward the idea of a social safety net. Remember that? Well, we need to counter this. Nets are very good for catching you when you're falling. But when you're caught in them, it's sometimes very difficult to get out of them. It's sometimes very easy to be trapped. Think of basic income as a foundation, not a net. A floor on which to stand solidly and to be able to reach for the sky. Exploitation. Libertarian economists, political theorists, politicians, who claim that liberty is their driving force, define liberty in a negative sense, in the sense of the absence of constraints, of voluntarism. If you've said yes to some contract, that contract must by definition be a free contract, therefore it must be some act of free will. Well, it's not. The mafia loves to give us options that we can't refuse, to make us offers we can't refuse. The fact that we say yes to them doesn't mean that they were chosen freely. The fact that the Greek government accepted the terms last summer of the Troika does not mean that it was a voluntary transaction. To have a free contract, to have a contract that is signed by both sides, representing and exuding the freedom of both sides, each side must have a capacity to say no. I said that before, I'm saying this once more, in the sense, freedom in action requires a basic income. Finally, again, beyond the macroeconomic, a basic income will allow for creative work to replace the kind of routine algorithmic work which is anyway being displaced by artificial intelligence. So if we want to ameliorate for the ill effects of capitalism undermining itself through producing gadgets that itself cannot survive, then we need to create a system whereby society stakes a claim to the returns to aggregate capital, and this claim becomes an income stream that goes to everyone. I don't see why my children and your children have a right to a trust fund, why Paris Hilton has a right to a trust fund when nobody else does, or very few people do. Think of basic income as a trust fund for all our children to be financed by dividends from our aggregate capital, which was, after all, created collectively. Thank you.
Other questions?
So we're going to take a few questions for Professor Varoufakis. So we got one there. I see one up here. Yep.
You've mentioned 3 reasons: the technology, the banks, and also the politics. Do you think is it an unfortunate coincidence, or is it related?
Oh, look, I always take a holistic approach, an organic approach. Of course, they're related. The reason why we've had the financialization drive of the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, which led us to where we are today, has a lot to do with technological change. And this technological change now, with 3D printers and machines that can replace human intelligence at the level of the service sector, is going to be in a vicious feedback effect with the effects of the combustion of financial capital. So the answer is they are utterly interwoven, interconnected, and interrelated.
Saw one right here.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I appreciate. I would like to be a little bit more radical, and that is my question. You said that a reason for the existence of a basic income, an unconditional basic income, is the fact that basic income, in any case, in a context of capitalistic valorization of today, comes from a collective labor that is organized by state, and then all the investment in R&D and technologies comes from the relationship between public property and private property, we can say. My radicality says that I think that the new technological transformation changes structurally the way of valorization and producing of wealth. That means, in a very slogan way, we can say that life itself is put to labor and is put to value. But
Can you repeat the last sentence?
The life,
yes,
our lives,
yes,
is put to labor and to value. There is an exploitation of life, a sort of subsumption of life that go beyond the classical subsumption between real and formal subsumption in Marxian terms. So it is a new way for labor organization and labor valorization. So I think that maybe the cultural shift that we need to do is to consider basic income as a sort of a remuneration of productive life, not only a part of social security and so on. So I think that it's something that goes behind the fact that there is a collective work,
So
by
we
something
gotta get to the
more.
question,
And I
yes.
think that it's very useful to stress about these topics, just to give confidence to the idea, to the cultural idea of basic income.
But
What
I
do you
don't see
think
why
about
we
it?
disagree.
Thank you.
I don't see why we disagree.
No, I don't disagree.
Yeah, okay.
I
So
will
we
say,
agree.
I will say that it's better to,
I put it simply by saying
to talk
okay,
in
okay.
terms of basic income as a sort of a remuneration.
Okay.
Great, thank
That-
you.
It's
that's fine.
complementary to wage.
That's fine. The way I prefer to say it is that it gives us an opportunity to reconsider the notion that wealth is privately produced and collectively appropriated, when the reality is exactly the opposite. And now, with the internet, for instance, take Google, take Huffington Post, take all the value creation by users, the complete breakdown of the distinction between consumer and worker. So all these corporations have huge input from their own customers. Their customers are producing value, and then they're being turned into fodder, which is being sold to advertisers for value to return, exchange value, to be returned directly to these corporations and exclusively to those corporations, especially given that these corporations pay hardly any tax. So basic income is a very simple way of ensuring that those who produce the value get a larger share of it. So I agree with you.
Let's take one right there, yep.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. I have a question that has kind of been bothering me all day concerning what you call the second earthquake or the rise of the machines. What about those jobs that are not being displaced by technological development but kind of evolving parallel to it, like, let's say, digital sweatshops on the Philippines or click working? So I feel like there's some kind of myth that digital technological innovation is going to replace everything, but isn't there also a job sector, a new job sector evolving where humans are actually doing rather machinic work to train algorithms, to click, to do Facebook censorship that actually requires human work?
You're quite right. But every technological innovation displaces jobs and creates jobs. What we're facing now is the first moment in history where the ones that are about to be displaced are far more numerous to the ones that which are being created, and the ones who are being created are much, much low-level jobs and more badly remunerated than the ones that are being destroyed. So, yes, you're right.
Okay, one right here, and then one right there.
Hi, good afternoon, Yanis.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi, how
Good to
are
see
you?
you.
Good to see you.
Haven't seen each other for ages.
The question I've got, Yanis, is tangential to universal basic income, but on your experience in government. What do you think the role of the state should be in the transition to the age of automation and the digital economy, and how the state tries to reorientate the skills agenda? At present, we have, in many countries in Europe, apprenticeship and skills agenda, which actually embed the structural weaknesses. So how do you think the state can perform a role in preparing the labour force for the age of automation?
That's a great question. I don't think I have an answer to this, Andrew. We certainly need the state to guide the process of not so much human capital formation, but the formation of the body of difficult knowledge which is necessary. See, the problem is that we have an educational system and an apprenticeship system that creates human capital of a low-brow variety, both in universities and in apprenticeships. We are dumbing down our educational system. We are creating incentives for students to study that which they are not good at and which is going to, by the time they graduate, will be irrelevant anyway. For instance, by ensuring that they leave universities with a great amount of debt, We are pushing them at the age of 18, 19 to make choices as to what they study on the basis of their own conception of what is lucrative, which firstly doesn't prove to be lucrative, and secondly, which forces them to do things that they're not good at, and therefore depletes the overall effect of education for society. Regarding apprenticeships, I think that, look, in Britain today, even a fantastic apprenticeship system is not going to work because the level of investment is so low. So what jobs will these apprentices get? To say that, you know, a supply-side story that if you create the good apprentices, good industry is going to move to Britain is a bit pie-in-the-sky material. The level of investment is very low, and it's not just in Britain. I am appalled by the statistic of recent that in Germany, the most successful European state, economy, we have the highest level of savings in the history of Germany and the lowest level of investment since 1945. So unless you have together an aggregate investment policy and educational settings and training settings that are in sync with investment, you're going to fail as a society.
I saw a last question. I saw a hand right there.
Thank you very much, Yanis, for a really interesting talk. I want to sort of push you a little bit further maybe and to get some more reflection, because I completely agree that being able to say no to a job is a requirement. But I also think the next step needs to be, there needs to be some kind of system that helps people figure out what they want to walk towards, right? What is it you want to self-actualize at? And I was wondering, do you have any ideas, if we introduce a basic income, what other systems should the state introduce in order to help people figure out in that process?
I don't agree with you on this, you know. I mean, I'm not, don't confuse me for a statist. I don't want the state to tell me what, you know, I should be aspiring to. I don't want the state to tell my daughter what she should become when she grows up. Indeed, I have very little time for all these professional orientation schemes, whether they're state or private, you know, especially when they take 13-year-olds at school and they give them these silly surveys and they tell them, you will become an engineer, you will be a hairdresser, and you're going to be a musician. This is all, you know, I have a very deep belief in the capacity of human minds to work things out for themselves if they don't have to live in terror. That is the main thing.
And with that, let's please give Yanis a warm thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Every monetary union comprises deficit and surplus regions, countries. Germany is a monetary union, and you've got the East Germany that will always have a deficit to Western Germany. And actually this deficit is getting worse, not better. So the idea that everybody should be a surplus region is preposterous, because my surplus must be somebody's deficit. And if you have a monetary union that is simply a union between just a money union of surplus and deficit countries, you're always going to have huge and increasing capital flow imbalances. So the money that accumulates in Frankfurt, for instance, is going to find its way to Spain, to Ireland, to Greece, in the form of loans, because money always flows to the deficit regions, because deficit regions are the ones, because they are in deficit, there is scarcity of money and the price of money is higher, the real rate of interest. So they will always be able to lend it more expensively to the weakest parts of the monetary union. And that creates bubbles in that part of the monetary union, which then burst, then you have austerity, then you have bailouts. It's a disaster. Unfortunately, the German government, the conservative government of Germany, or conservative SPD government of Germany, has always resisted a rational discussion of how to deal with this problem. the dogma that your debt is your debt and it's nothing to do with me. Even though we're in the same monetary union and your debt is essential to my surplus, is absurd. And this absurdity and the denial that we need to have this conversation in Europe, which comes mainly from Berlin, is a major contributor to the crisis, which is now biting here in Germany as well, in the form of negative interest rates and so on. Europe is fantastic at creating new terms by which to hide realities. So the number one objective of the European Union was convergence. You will recall that. The idea was to bring different countries closer together and effectively to have a one-speed Europe where everybody's converging and the Germanys and the Greeces become closer together in terms of the competitiveness gap, in terms of incomes per capita, and so on and so forth. This failed. This failed spectacularly. The failure of this is a failure of the European Union. It is becoming increasingly a European disunion. Now, in its infinite wisdom, instead of admitting failure and doing something about it, trying to correct it, Europe has decided that it will give it a new name, give the failure a new name, and proclaim its success. So they call it multi-speed. Now we have all for multi-speed Europe. Instead of saying now the EU is the UED, the European disunion. So, this is what we do. We rename failure success, and then we celebrate. In 2008, we had the collapse of pyramids of what I call private money. You see, up until the 1970s, early 1980s, money was publicly produced, minted by central banks. But with financialization, with these new forms of convoluted debt, the distinction between debt and money, which was always very clear, money was something that had no capacity to produce more money on its own, interest. Debt was exchanged, but it was not a means of exchange. But with financialization, new forms of very pliable, very dynamic, self-reproducing debt became a means of exchange. So, to begin with, banks started trading with one another, those exotic forms of debt that they were creating. And very soon after that, they started paying on each other by means of this debt. So money became malleable. A lot of debt instruments were transformed into forms of money. So suddenly, it was not just the Central Bank of the United States, the Fed, or the Bundesbank here in Germany, or the Bank of England that were producing money. Private banks started producing their own forms of money. And if you give somebody the capacity to produce money, they produce a hell of a lot of it. And they produce so much that it could not sustain its own weight. So it collapsed in 2008. That was the financial crisis of 2008 in a nutshell. Now, when the private money pyramids collapsed, imploded, combusted, that left the banks insolvent because everybody owed to everyone and no one could pay. So the state came back in, the central banks came in and minted a great deal of money, as well as transferred wealth and income from the poorer citizens to the banks to save them. So we have a very interesting phenomenon from 2008 onwards. Before 2008, the argument in favor of capitalism was that it was like a jungle, like nature, where the fittest survive. And the more efficient you are, the greater your chances of doing well. After 2008, the more bankrupt you were, the greater the capacity that you had to extract value from the rest of society. This is the regime that I am referring to as bankruptocracy, ruled by the bankrupt banks. The more bankrupt the banks, the more powerful the bankers who bankrupted their banks. Of course, New Deal, as we all know, was Franklin Roosevelt's policy in 1933 by which to deal with the Great Depression and with all the political monsters that that depression and the grapes of wrath, as Steinbeck described that depression, was breeding. Because this is what happens when you have a deflation, depression, you have political monsters, you have racism, you have xenophobia. And what was the idea behind the New Deal? Capitalism collapsed, fell on its face, and could not get up after 1929, 1930, 31, 32. And when capitalism goes into this kind of spasm, into this vicious crisis, you have a very large quantity of savings and zero investment. And nothing that the market can do will bring the two together, because pessimism breeds pessimism, and pessimism gives rise to an investment strike by investors, and therefore investment cannot rise up, even though there are savings to be invested, because those who have the money are too scared to invest it in productive processes. So the idea of the New Deal was to have the state soak up the excess savings and put them to work. And that was the New Deal, and it worked quite well in the United States. So we need something similar in Europe. That's why DiEM25 is putting forward its European New Deal idea, which is primarily a way of taking the excess cash. We have something like 4 trillion euros of money sitting in bank accounts doing nothing in Europe. When investment is so low and the quality of jobs is non-existent and hopelessness is ruling the day. So our European New Deal has this as a primary objective: how to energize existing cash for good reasons, good purposes, like the Green Energy Union and the research and development in renewable energy sources that Europe desperately needs for the purposes of fighting climate change, creating good jobs, and disentangling ourselves from Gazprom and Mr. Putin. That's the primary objective. But there are, together with all this, we have answers for all the other sub-problems that the lack of investment generates. Public debt, not just for countries like Greece, but also for countries like Italy, even France. What to do with the banking sectors that are in disarray all over Europe. Poverty, fighting poverty, and what to do with the Eurozone. So we have been working now for more than a year, the combination of economists, experts, and members of DiEM25, rank and file activists, hundreds of them. We have gone through the very difficult process of producing what we think is a very interesting and very useful, comprehensive agenda for economic and social policy throughout Europe, to be applied not only in Eurozone member states, but also members of the EU that are not in the Eurozone, and also European countries that are not even in the European Union or are about to leave the European Union, like Britain. So it's a continental plan which is applicable in every country, and it is our antidote for TINA, for the dogma that there is no alternative, because this dogma is what is destroying Europe. Let's begin with our ideas regarding sharing the proceeds of automation. We have a proposal for creating a European equity fund, which is going to have a number of different sources of income. One would be a percentage of shares of corporations incorporated in Europe, IPOs, increases in capitalization, say 10% of all new shares go in there. Why? What is the point of this? Capital is increasingly socialized. in terms of its production. So every time you search something on Google, you're contributing to the capital of Google. So capital is produced socially increasingly, but the returns to capital are still private. This incongruity is not only unfair, but it is also macroeconomically problematic, because the more you have the privatization of socially produced capital, the lower the demand for the commodities that capital produces, and the greater the problem with investment and aggregate demand. So we are proposing a universal basic dividend, not a universal basic income in the form of taxation, but in terms of returns of capital. Returns of capital must be socialized because the production of capital is socialized. So this is just one example. Similarly, or going beyond that, on the question of providing employment, we believe that it is essential to bring together, under the progressive umbrella of DiEM25, or any progressive international movement, transnational movement, the left and the Greens. The two have had a very serious difficulty for many decades now conversing. Usually those who are interested in things like climate change and looking after the planet are not interested in social issues, and those who are interested in jobs are not interested in climate change. So we're trying to combine the two by saying that we need a carbon tax, a very simple, plain vanilla carbon tax to be applied throughout Europe, and the process of the carbon tax should create a jobs guarantee scheme. People should get an opportunity to do socially useful work in their own communities and get paid a small but substantial sum of money for doing this. This is going to help the welfare state, because people will have income and pay tax. Secondly, it will stop involuntary migration. People leave their communities and migrate to large cities or to other countries, to London, to Berlin and so on, not because they want to move, but because they have no alternative. And it will give rise to a different kind of social contract, a different kind of feeling that what is now missing in communities that feel discarded, and they become attracted and lured by xenophobia and movements like the AfD here in Germany, Brexit in Britain, and so on and so forth. So there is a very large array of issues that our European New Deal policy paper is addressing. Too many to enumerate in an interview like this. I invite our viewers to go to diem25.org and have a look at the European New Deal paper and tell us where they disagree with us. I'm sure that there are many elements of it that can be improved. But we believe that this is the very first time somebody tried to ask, a movement tried to ask the question, what should we do in Europe? Because if you think about it, even progressive parties have not asked themselves that question. They talk about local issues, about national issues. But confronting the European crisis as a systemic crisis systematically is something that no one has done. The European Parliament has not done it, the European Commission has not done it, the European Party of the Left has not done it. Diem has done it. Industry. Industry is getting away with murder in terms of climate change. The attempt by the European Union to create a pseudo-market for emissions, for CO2, failed spectacularly, because they tried to use a neoliberal solution for something that neoliberalism has no solutions for. They tried to create the emissions trading scheme, and it failed. It just crashed and burned. So this is why we are saying it's high time that we replace it with a very, very simple tax, where CO2 emissions bring a cost to those who create them at the level of industry. Now, we should all pay for the environment, each according to his or her capacity, and each according to his or her damage that they inflict upon the environment. There's no doubt about that. And if we need to incentivize citizens to leave their CO2 producing diesels behind and pressurize politicians and local governments for better green transport systems, that's a good thing. Innovation is essential for any dynamic society that wants to keep moving into the future proudly and happily. But every innovative society requires those who do the old-fashioned work of maintaining existing systems, both technical systems and social systems. So those who replace power lines, this is not rocket science. It's not, artificial intelligence. It's old-fashioned work that has been happening for decades, but it is essential work. Those who clean the sewers, those who rebuild the sewers, it's very dirty work. It is not rocket science. It's not particularly popular and impressive, but it is essential. Without the sewers, we'll all die of disease. Those who take meals to old people in their homes, the nurses, the teachers, the nursery teachers, these are the maintainers of a society that modern society, capitalist modern society, has neglected, has discarded, has treated with contempt, but yet they are the ones who are keeping the whole show on the road, and it is about time that to look after them. We treated them with the respect that they deserve, and we also rewarded them for doing the dirty jobs, the difficult jobs, the essential jobs, without which society will crumble and simply not be worth living in. My experience, speaking to many different kinds of representatives of German society, is that this country consists of citizens caught up in a wave of insecurity. Yes, everybody is in surplus. The government is in surplus, corporations are in surplus, households have savings. But each and every citizen in this country knows in their bones that this is not sustainable. Because let's face it, if everybody's saving in a country like France, in a country like Germany, somebody has to borrow. And if the country is in surplus in aggregate, effectively all your savings in this country will have to be sent abroad to be invested. So it's like entrusting your future to foreigners whom you cannot control. That causes a great deal of disdain in Germany, and rightly so, because it destabilizes the rest of the world too. Effectively, you are exporting deflation to the rest of Europe and to the rest of the world. And by exporting deflation, you are bringing the point in time closer when there is going to be a fall in demand for your net exports, for net German exports abroad. And when you combine this with an aging population and a Europe which is increasingly in the clasps of centrifugal forces that are tearing it apart, Germany is riding a wave that it cannot continue forever, that is going to crash, and the effect of this crash is going to be humanly very problematic for the people of Germany and for the people of Europe. So in effect, what DiEM25, the message of DiEM25 to the average German citizen and voter, who may be conservative, who may not have at the top of their list of priorities a pan-European, transnational, progressive agenda, our message is that beware. A surplus can only be sustained if the deficit of the others is also sustainable. And the deficit of the others is not sustainable, your surplus is not sustainable, and therefore your savings are in peril. And the only way we can stabilize your future is by stabilizing the future of Europe. And this is what DiEM25 can offer. An European New Deal with the capacity and the rationality, and I believe Germans are very drawn to the idea of rationality, as they should be, because of the tradition in this country of practical reasoning, to stabilize everybody's future at once. DiEM25 is against the idea of a universal basic income that is funded through taxation. Because if you tax workers so that other workers don't work and sit on their couch, and they have a right to do this and watch television, whereas others are working for them, this is corrosive politics. It is going to turn one segment of the working class against another. And especially if it's a universal income, that is, the rich get it as well. Why should a poor person pay taxes for a rich person to receive additional income to the mountains of money that they already have? So this is why, for instance, DiEM25 disagreed with our friend Benoit Hamon, who proposed in the last presidential election in France a universal basic income funded by taxation. But at the moment, we're facing a very serious challenge from technological innovation, from artificial intelligence. When robots and artificial intelligence empowered machines, more generally, pass the so-called Turing test, that is, we reach a stage where you pick up the phone, you call your bank, you call a restaurant to order takeaway, and you cannot distinguish from the voice that you hear on the phone whether this is a machine speaking to you or a human being, because they sound similar and they do the same job, talking to you. Then suddenly you can imagine the impact this is going to have on employment throughout capitalism. In the 1970s and 80s, we had a shift of employment from industry to the service sector, to banks, to supermarkets, to restaurants. Yeah? The moment machines overcome the Turing test, pass it, you're going to have, for the first time in the history of capitalism, technology destroying a lot more jobs than it is creating. So you're going to have a massive reduction in aggregate demand. This is going to create more deflationary forces. Income will become even more concentrated in the hands of those who own the machines. But even they will suffer in the long term because the demand will not be there for the product of their machines. So this is something we really need to think very carefully about. It is clear that the returns, the money earned by the machines, must be spread out. The solution, so we need a universal basic income, but not one funded by taxation. We need effectively to take the returns to capital, the returns to automation, and spread them throughout society. Because let's face it, all these artificial, take your smartphone. Your smartphone, whether it's an Apple, a Samsung, a Sony, whatever it is, most of the technologies in there were provided by public funding. Every time you search on a search engine, you contribute to the capital of that company, Google, Microsoft, whatever they are. So the capital base on which these new products are being created, and the robots, is socially produced. The capitalists who own those companies do not have the right to hold the returns to capital because they did not produce that capital. It was produced by the state, it was produced by the public, it's crowdsourced. So we need to socialize the returns to capital. And that is not taxation. Effectively, what we're saying is a part of the rights, the property rights, to the returns of capital, or the property rights over a segment of the returns to capital, must be flowing into a social fund, social welfare fund, or wealth fund, from which everybody gets paid a dividend, as if we are shareholders, because we are shareholders in artificial intelligence. We should be shareholders. So this is the fundamental distinction. fund a universal basic dividend, but not from taxation, but from the returns of capital, and that's DiEM25's position. Well, ideally, we should live in a world where machines are our slaves and do all the terrible jobs that we don't want to do, from taking the rubbish out to accounting. Who wants to do accounting? Why should anyone want to do accounting? If your machine can do your accounts for you, you should let the machine do the accounts for you. You should write poetry, go on a walk, meet with friends, read books. Yeah, that would be fantastic. That would be an ideal world. But the issue is not whether we should support technology. Of course we should. The more technology, the better. What the threat is that because you have private ownership of that technology and highly concentrated ownership, which gives immense extractive power to the owners of that technology, you end up with social failure. You end up with a situation where the capacity of youngsters and older people to share in the benefits from the technology disappears, and you have huge social conflict and social and economic and macroeconomic failures. So it's not, tools are tools. The question is how do you use them? We need more tools, we need better technology, we need robots to do all the chores for us, but we better socialize them and democratize them. If you look carefully at our proposal, we're already doing this, because our proposal, if it goes through, entails a major reform of corporations. A segment of their shares is going to be publicly owned. So you effectively have partial socialization of the corporations. This is the first step towards democratizing them. So the universal basic dividend idea, as opposed to the universal basic income idea, is one that incorporates reforming corporations and socializing the returns to capital and automation. Well, back in the 19th century, anyone who has read Charles Dickens will know this, there were prisons for debtors. People who could not repay their debts would be thrown in prison until they repaid their debt, which was, of course, a very silly idea. Because if you take somebody and put him in prison, it's very unlikely that they will make enough money to repay their debts, especially if they couldn't repay them when they were outside prison. Capitalism, to succeed, had to get rid of that mentality. The debtor's prison or the workhouse had to be abolished. And along with limited liability, that was the prerequisite for capitalism to succeed, to grow. Limited liability. What's limited liability? Every large company has limited liability. That is, when it goes bust, the people running it, they do not lose their house. They do not end up in prison. If you have limited liability for large corporations but not for countries, then, well, you are seriously asking for trouble. John Maynard Keynes and the New Dealers in government in Washington agreed on one thing, that the post-war capitalist order, if it had any chance of not returning to the Great Depression of the 1930s, it had to be based on a very simple idea. Stability through fixed exchange rates between the dollar and the Deutschmark and the French franc and the British pound and so on and so forth, while at the very same time having a surplus recycling mechanism, a mechanism by which surpluses from the surplus countries were taken and invested or spent in the deficit countries. If you don't have this recycling mechanism, capitalism collapses in the end, or you end up like the Eurozone today. Where they disagreed, where Keynes and the New Dealers disagreed, was the New Dealers, being American of course, were absolutely adamant that it should be the United States of America that does the surplus recycling. Their view was understandable. It's our surpluses, we do what we want with them. But Keynes was far more farsighted. He could see that America would not always be a surplus country, and what happens when America loses its surpluses, as it happened in the late 60s, while Bretton Woods collapsed the system. So Keynes had this idea of a world bank, not the world bank we have, but a world clearing bank or a central bank that would issue a currency that would be common to all of us. It would be an accounting fictitious currency. Today it would be a digital currency. You wouldn't have it in your pockets. You would still have euros or Deutschmarks or dollars or whatever in your pocket, but all trade would be denominated in this fictitious currency issued by the clearing, he called it the International Clearing Union, the ICU, something like the IMF perhaps. And so all trade would be denominated in this, and every country would be subject to a very simple rule, that if your trade deficit exceeds a certain amount, a certain percentage of these currency units of yours are put in the bank. And similarly, if you have a surplus, you get penalized. And the money that accumulates in this account is used for global developmental investment, especially in the deficit countries. That would be a great stabilizing mechanism, a shock absorber, and a mechanism for preventing crashes. He was very far ahead of his time. The Americans turned him down, and in the end, they themselves suffered from it, as we've seen after the collapse of Bretton Woods in 1971. The German government, in particular Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble, talk again and again and again about the rules and how important they are. Now, of course, this is true. They do insist that everybody else sticks to the rules. But it turns out that they themselves don't. So, for instance, agreements. When agreements are broken by Greece or by Portugal, Greece and Portugal are lambasted. But there are several important, crucial agreements made with Greece, which were violated from the other side. So, for instance, there was an agreement that the profits made by the European Central Bank on Greek government bonds should be returned to Greece. Those have not been returned to Greece. Instead, Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble pocketed a very large percentage of them and put them in his budget against the explicit agreements at the Eurogroup level. Let me give you another example of broken rules. According to the excessive deficit and surplus or imbalances procedures in the European Union, not only should you get penalized if you have an excessive budget deficit, but you should also be penalized an excessive trade surplus. Anything above 6% of GDP should immediately bring upon you a penalty. Now, Germany has violated this by the means of a trade surplus which is more than 9.5%, not 6, 9.5%. And what has happened to the rule according to which it should be penalized by the EU? It has been quietly forgotten. Now, what happens when rules are only applied to the weak? You end up with an autocracy like we had in the 19th century. It used to be called something like gunboat diplomacy. This is what we have today.
Welcome to acTVism Munich. I'm your host, San Raza. Western politics appears, for the common person at least, to be in disarray and in a state of dysfunctionality. In the most powerful and richest country, the United States of America, the Trump administration, some argue, is implementing economic policies that will only benefit the 1%. In Britain, the jury's still out on Brexit. Will we erect new fences and barriers, or will freedom of movement prevail in Western Europe? In Germany, although unemployment levels are below 6%, a far-right, nationalistic, xenophobic party in the AfD has become the third largest political force. And yet, establishment parties in Germany are unable to find consensus within their own ranks, let alone conjure economic and social policies that will address the needs of Germany and, for that matter, of Europe. In Europe's periphery, unemployment continues to remain high, especially befalling on the youth. In places like Spain and Greece, youth unemployment is around 40%. This is not only eroding the European idea, but contributing to nationalism and separatism. Today I'm joined by Yanis Varoufakis, an intellectual and activist who's paving a new path with his socio-economic, progressive pan-European plan called the European New Deal. Yanis is also the co-founder of the Democracy in Europe movement, former finance minister of Greece, and the author of many books, the latest being Adults in the Room, My Battle with Europe's Deep Establishment. Yanis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for all the good work you're doing.
Before we start this series, I want to tell our viewers we did a whole educational series on the European New Deal, which Yanis conjured. So go back to our YouTube channel and check out the entire video list. So Yanis, let's start with the United States. The Trump administration recently announced deep tax cuts, and right after that, Apple announced they would be investing $350 billion back in the United States and create 20,000 jobs. Even Germany's car manufacturers are enthusiastic about this. What is your assessment on these tax cuts and what effects will they have on the United States and in Europe?
It constitutes the largest transfer of wealth and income from the have-nots to the haves since the Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush tax reforms. Every time the Republican Party in the United States reforms the tax system, there is a gigantic shift of income from the poor to the rich. It's really very simple. The numbers that you just quoted are pitiful. But they couldn't be otherwise, because think about it. You mentioned Apple. Apple already have $265 billion parked in bank accounts. That is surplus money, which is sitting there in their bank accounts doing nothing. They're refusing to invest it. It is a preposterous notion that if you give them a tax cut, if you give them another 30 billion, 50 billion, that they are going to invest more. Why will they? It's not lack of funding. They have 260 billion sitting there doing nothing. Why would they invest the additional funding that they will get from the rest of American society when they are not doing it with the money that they already have sitting there? This is a more general repercussion of the way in which the 2008 great financial international crisis has created ripples and sub-crises that we are still laboring under. After 2008, globalized, financialized capitalism has ended up in a situation where we have worldwide, and more so in Europe and in the United States, the highest level of idle savings in the history of capitalism. So if you compare two mountains of money, one is savings, money that is sitting there doing nothing. And the second mountain is investment. The investment mountain is the lowest we've had for decades, and the savings mountain is the highest we've had for decades. This simply reinforces the view, the truth, if you want. It establishes the truth that capitalism is failing to reproduce itself. It is failing to create investments that then will give rise to the incomes which are necessary in order to purchase the stuff that industry can produce. And therefore, industry underinvests. There is there is a dearth of good quality jobs, and that feeds into discontent. And the result is you have the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, and you have the Trump administration. You mentioned that Germany has a low level of unemployment. Yes, but at the same time, you have very poor quality jobs. You have very, very badly paying jobs. So overall, the wage share, as we say in economics, the proportion of income that goes to workers is very low in Germany. It is the lowest it's been since the post-war era. And that, of course, feeds into discontent. So the Trump administration, effectively what it does what all administrations under the so-called neoliberal order have been doing it. But of course, Donald Trump being Donald Trump, he supercharges that. He does what everybody else is doing with a great enthusiasm that others cannot emulate.
So we can safely assume that the $200 billion infrastructure plan that he just announced, and he said, I quote, it's a historic investment. He said also that they're going to undo a lot of red tape and this will be a public-private partnership. How would you assess this infrastructure plan? Is it reminiscent of Roosevelt's 1930s New Deal?
It is a complete and utter joke. It doesn't exist. It is a figment of Donald Trump's imagination. Look, Trump got elected on the basis of two promises, if you want, at the economic level. The first promise was to the rich, I'm going to cut your taxes. And the second promise was to American society, to the great mass of people that, especially from white working class, blue collar workers in the United States, who are struggling, have been struggling for a very long time, and they voted en masse for Trump. His promise to them was, okay, I will cut the taxes of the rich, but I'm going to implement a New Deal program, a large infrastructure investment program from which you're going to benefit, because there will be jobs for blue-collar workers, reconstructing bridges, building roads, funding new dams and green technologies and so on. He did fulfill his promise to the rich. He cut savagely corporation tax from 35% to 21%. This is a major source of celebration for the ultra-rich in the United States. So he was true to his promise to the rich. What did he do with the poor and the blue-collar workers that supported him? He cheated them. This New Deal program, this infrastructure program, is a complete and utter joke. 200 billion is a pittance, especially if you take into consideration the fact that it will be phased in for 10 years. So it's like 20 billion. 20 billion is not even worth mentioning. It's chicken feed. And the rest is supposed to come from the states, but the states have no money, and he's not planning to give them any money. To make it even worse, he's at the very same time cutting everything else. So it's not a net injection into the economy. He's going to take this money from Medicare, from Medicaid, from the provision of basic insurance to common folks. There's going to be a reduction in the amount of money the federal government is spending on environmental cleanups. So the net effect is zero. It may be negative. In other words, there is no New Deal. There is no infrastructural program. Donald Trump has purposely, willfully, strategically decided to honor his promise to the rich and to defraud the poor.
What should European progressives and American progressives do at this point in time? We know that the elections are going to be in 2020, I believe. And what issues should they be paying attention to, and what should they be organizing and mobilizing around?
Well, first a comment. Europeans have no right to be smug about our situation while criticizing and chastising Donald Trump, because Europe has been just as pathetic as Donald Trump has been in introducing investment plans. Think about the great promises by Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker when he got elected to be president of the European Commission, the Juncker plan of the many, many billions that was going to go into a New Deal for Europe, an infrastructure spending program. None of this happened. This was all pre-existing money that was already going to be spent, that was reassigned. And again, exactly what Donald Trump is doing to say, this will be public-private ventures. This was exactly the Juncker plan. So once again, even though here in Europe we like to talk a good talk and to chastise Americans for having elected Donald Trump and Donald Trump himself, we are no better here. Okay, I close the parenthesis. What should progressives do? We should band together. We should join forces across the Atlantic, European progressives and American progressives, to introduce an international New Deal project whereby both the United States and Europe, under a progressive leadership, of course, implement a global New Deal, an international New Deal. One that involves two pillars. One is investment banks, public investment vehicles, and a green transition works project. You mentioned FDR, President Roosevelt, in the 1930s and 1940s. He had created a works agency. We need to create a works agency in Europe, and the Americans need something similar. While at the same time, our investment banks must issue the bonds that are necessary in order to soak up the excess liquidity in the private financial sector with the support of the Federal Reserve in the United States and the European Central Bank through quantitative easing, that is, having the central banks purchase those bonds in the secondary or even in the primary markets. This is the only thing that can prevent this perpetual crisis, which feeds into right-wing populism and racism. But of course, in order to do that, we need to win power. Donald Trump has many disadvantages and is bringing untold hardship and risks to the world. But he has demonstrated that it is possible to win against the established order in order to introduce a radical plan. The tragedy is that his radical plan is misanthropic. So what we need to do as progressives, since you asked, in Europe and the United States, is win in order to introduce a philanthropic, a humane, a rational, Green New Deal across both sides of the Atlantic Ocean.
We can also argue that if it wasn't for the shenanigans of the Democratic Party, we might have had Bernie Sanders. But putting that aside, let's move on to Britain. For the common people in Germany, especially the media, there's a lot of talk about Brexit, but there's no concrete explanation. So people are like, there's a lot of smoke around this issue. So can you give us a background on the Brexit negotiation and whether you think a second referendum should be undertaken?
Well, for the benefits of full disclosure, DiEM25 and me personally, we campaigned against Brexit. So we are staunch anti-Brexiteers. Why? Not because we think that the European Union is made of roses and good mechanisms and institutions. No, we think that the European Union is a democracy-free zone that we must confront, but not disintegrate. We have a duty to be inside this European Union against this European Union. That is our view, and I'm stating it for the purpose of making sure that our audience, our viewers know exactly the foundation, the assumptions, if you want, the prejudices with which I'm answering your question. So, having established that, let me proceed to my answer. The tragedy now with these Brexit negotiations is that you have a London government and a Brussels establishment negotiating when neither of them care about the interests of the people of Britain and the interests of the people of Europe. The London government is only interested in survival, political survival of the British cabinet. The British Prime Minister is extremely weakened. She is presiding over a government that lacks a majority in Parliament, an absolute majority in Parliament. Every single member of the cabinet want to stab her in the back, but they are prevented from doing so because they want her to deliver first a bad Brexit deal that she was going to be condemned for, so that they can then elevate into her position if they can. Not exactly a government in pursuit of the interests of the people of Britain. On the other hand, in Brussels, you have a European Union establishment for whom a mutually advantageous agreement, Brexit agreement with Britain, is a nightmare, because they are not interested in such a mutually advantageous agreement. Such an agreement would signal to other member states in Europe that they can confront Brussels. They can threaten perhaps with an exit from the European Union and then end up with a decent deal. So the one thing they want to do is they want to demonstrate that anyone that votes to get out of the European Union gets a bad deal, even if this bad deal comes at a very large cost for Europeans as well. So, to put it very bluntly, the negotiations that are now taking place between Britain and Brussels are designed to fail. They're designed to produce a terrible outcome for the people of Britain and the people of Europe. This is why our position as DiEM25 has been, from the day after the referendum, that there should be no such negotiations. These negotiations must be stopped, because whatever they will produce is going to be detrimental to the future of Europe and Britain. How do you stop these negotiations? There are two ways of stopping these negotiations. One is to have a hard Brexit, Britain simply getting out with no deal. That would be disastrous for everyone. There's a second way, though. For Britain to go into a Norway-style relationship with the European Union, where it stays for a period of 5 years, let's say, renewable, within the European Economic Area, the single market. It then immediately acquires again its sovereignty regarding fisheries and regarding agriculture. It is outside the European Commission, it's outside the European Parliament, so it has fulfilled the mandate for Brexit. Britain will no longer be a member of the EU. But at the same time, let's face it, the referendum of June 2016 did not specify what kind of Brexit. It specified simply that the people of Britain narrowly voted in favor of Brexit. This small C conservative transition is also going to give the House of Commons an opportunity to debate in peace and in quiet what kind of future arrangements the UK should have with the European Union. It provides no disruption, perfect continuity for business as well as citizens, both in Britain and the European Union. And in the end, is the only sensible way of proceeding, the only sensible transition period that we need. You asked me about a second referendum. I think that the second referendum by which to try to annul the first referendum would be awful. And it would be awful because it will be signaling to those who voted for Brexit that their views are not taken seriously. Let's face it, if the referendum had delivered a Remain verdict, there would never be a second referendum. There will never be a discussion of a second referendum. So it is like telling the Brexiteers, those who voted in favor of Brexit, that you're second-rate citizens. When you win, we ask the people of Britain to go back to the ballot boxes until they deliver the right verdict. So even though I'm a Remainer, a radical Remainer, but Remainer nevertheless, I think that as a Democrat, I cannot possibly condone a second referendum. Brexit has to take place. But I think that the Norway-style agreement would provide the continuity and the mutual advantages that are necessary both for Britain and for the European Union. Personally, I would like to see a second referendum in 2024, 2025, not to annul the first one, because Brexit must take place. No, but to have a campaign trying to convince the people of Britain to re-enter a reformed and progressive and democratized EU at some point in the future. But that is for the future.
So let's move on to Germany then. But before we talk about recent political events, I want to talk about Martin Schulz, the former president of the European Parliament. Since last year, there was a lot of hype among Martin Schulz, and somehow the German media forgot to mention his role in the European Union. So can you talk about his role when he was the president of the European Parliament and his approach towards European countries like Greece?
Well, I can tell you from personal experience that Martin Schulz, like quite a few social democrats from Germany, talked sweetly about Greece, but when it came to the crunch, when it came to the moments when the Troika was pushing the knife inside our back, Martin Schulz was completely aligned with the Troika. I think that the people of Europe know that, the people of Germany understand that. But moving beyond this, since Schulz likes to present himself as a great Europeanist and the voice, the pro-EU voice in Germany, in German politics. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. This is all just propaganda. It's all about image. It's not about reality. It's not about substance. Let me remind you that when Emmanuel Macron issued his proposals for a federation light, as I call it, a small federation for the Eurozone. And what was the main proposal? A proposal which, by the way, I thought was too lukewarm, too little, and too late. But nevertheless, he put forward his proposal for a common budget in the Eurozone and a common finance minister that would be managing that budget. Immediately, the Christian Democrats in Germany said, "Nein." Wolfgang Schäuble said, no. we have the European Stability Mechanism. We can turn into European Monetary Fund, effectively making countries that borrow from that common fund fall more or less under a similar regime of colonialism as Greece, when Greece borrowed from Europe as part of the so-called bailout. So this was an outright rejection by the Christian Democrats, which one would have expected. What did Martin Schulz say? Exactly the same thing. He refused to side with Emmanuel Macron on the common budget, and he himself spoke in favor of the European Monetary Fund. So the trouble with social democrats, German social democrats, SPD, establishment political figures, is that they like to present themselves in a pro-European light, when in reality, when they actually make the decision and they have to come down one way or the other, they always fall into the camp of the liquidationist, Wolfgang Schäuble-like Christian Democrats. This is why they are now sliding in the polls, and very soon they will be below the Alternative for Deutschland.
The SPD and the CDU recently struck an agreement, although it has to be still finalized by its members on the 4th of May, I believe. In this coalition agreement, the SPD gained a lot of ministries, including the influential foreign affairs and finance. Do you see this as the revival of the SPD?
I see this as the Waterloo of the SPD. The reason why the SPD is falling in the estimation of the German working class, the reason why the German workers and the German progressives are turning their back to the SPD, is the SPD's continuous co-opting or being co-opted into the Christian Democrat liquidationist regressive mindset and politics. By striking a deal that maintains their access to ministerial offices and limousines, in exchange of this continuing acceptance of the Christian Democrat liquidationist, anti-European, in the end, mindset, in exchange for a few trinkets here and there in the domestic scene, is what will end with the tragedy of the social democratic project that we've seen elsewhere. In France, the socialists, the social democrats there have disintegrated, as you've seen. In my country, where all bad things begin here in Greece, PASOK, the Socialist Party, went from 44% of the vote to 4% of the vote as a result of being co-opted by the spirit of the Troika, if you want, which is now completely and totally dominant even in countries like Germany. And they will end up like this. I told Sigmar Gabriel in one of our meetings that if you continue this way, you are going to have the fate of PASOK. No wonder he didn't like me very much. But tragically, I think that this is being confirmed by the process of history.
Specifically about Catalonia, can you comment about the stalemate there? And also, since as a finance minister of Greece, you were making plan Bs for a digitalized banking system that had also the tax ID code, I believe. Is it possible for Catalonia to separate and somehow not run out of liquidity? Because I believe that the European Union won't actually allow this move to happen.
Well, let's relax about these matters. Let's try to detoxify the toxic political debates in Catalonia and in Spain. The tragedy of the last year in Catalonia and in Spain has been the breakdown of any serious debate, any serious dialogue between competing views on the Catalonia issue. Every time our democracies lose their capacity to provide a forum for a reasoned dialogue, we all suffer. The events of last autumn with the scenes in polling stations in Catalonia where the civil guard, the Spanish civil guard was beating up voters, the fact that we still have politicians who are in prison for their political beliefs and campaigns in a European country like Spain is deplorable. These are deplorable facts. And when you have Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission, say, this is an internal Spanish issue, this is the moment to seriously worry. Because what kind of message does this send to illiberal democrats, in inverted commas, in Hungary, in Poland, in various countries, in Austria now, that have ultra-right-wing governments who are planning the next round of diminishing civil liberties, civil rights, and the rule of law. It sends a very bad message. So as DiEM25, we have been pursuing a pan-European agenda for Catalonia and for other parts of the European Union, or member states of the European Union, that may be considering seceding from their nation state. We think that there must be agreed rules under which we decide as Europeans that a certain region should be granted the right to hold a binding referendum on secession. All the issues concerning the monetary system, currency, taxation, and so on must be embedded in this European democratic process. What you mentioned, a potential digital currency for a country like Catalonia, if it becomes a separate country, these are all emergency measures that will have to be implemented if the rule of law breaks down and if we fail to Europeanize the problem and find a European solution to it.
So let's talk about Greece. There was a lot of talk last year about economic recovery. I believe that was the same line before you came into power in 2015, the great economic success story of Greece. So at the behest of the creditors, a new law was recently passed that limits the workers to strike, which ignited a wave of protests at the moment. So can you talk about this contradictory situation? At one hand, there's recovery, but at the other hand, people are protesting a new law?
There's no contradictory situation. There is no recovery. And that is why people are not so much demonstrating, because we don't have that many demonstrations in Greece anymore. People are so depressed. And you see, depression has two meanings. One is the economic depression, and the other is the psychological depression. And now we have both, like a dark cloud hanging over our cities and our countryside. The story that you hear a lot of, that Greece has now recovered, is what the English say, well, it reflects the English expression, adding insult to injury. Not only are we continuing to fall into the black hole of our debt deflation, our crisis, but also we have the oligarchy here in Greece, the media that they control, as well as the oligarchy and the media outside of Greece celebrating the end of the Greek crisis. It's pure wishful thinking, it's pure propaganda. To quote Tacitus, they made a desert and they called it peace. So let me give you a very simple example. People say, oh, but look, Yanis, or Zain, the unemployment rate has decreased significantly from 27 to 20%. Still 20% is a ludicrous number, but nevertheless. Yes, it has decreased, but why has it decreased? Because people have left the country, especially young, well-educated people who have left the country. Is this a reason to celebrate or to be depressed? I think the latter. And also, what we have had is we continue to lose full-time jobs that are replaced by more part-time jobs on 300 euros a month. 300 euros a month, yeah, in a country where prices are the same as they are in Germany, if not higher. And so when you have two part-timers receiving 300 euros each monthly, replacing one full-timer, this counts as an increase in employment, when it's not, really. It is a vast diminution in total hours worked, and, of course, a significant diminution in total worker income in this country. So there is no recovery. We have the same old story. The establishment has been authoritarian and incompetent. They have made the crisis worse, but they decided, well, we will call it a success, and we will use the ironclad power of the media in order to impose this narrative on everybody else.
Yanis Varoufakis, former finance minister of Greece and co-founder of the Democracy in Europe movement, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Zain.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on one of the logos that will appear on this screen. And please don't forget to donate so we can continue to produce independent news and analysis. I'm your host, Zain Raza. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to The Source, a program dedicated to providing a voice to whistleblowers, former insiders, and policy experts. My name is Zan Raza, and today we are joined by best-selling author, former finance minister of Greece, and the co-founder of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025, Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis, thank you for joining us again.
Great pleasure.
So before I delve into the socio and economic issues surrounding Europe, I want to briefly touch upon Julian Assange, who has been forced to seek refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London since 2012. And up till recently, he wasn't charged for anything. So now the Ecuadorian embassy is tightening restrictions around him, and there are reports that the US government is planning to criminally prosecute him. What precedent does this set for publishers, and what does this mean for press freedoms?
Well, first, they are getting Julian, then they will get you, me, everyone. This is a clear struggle for freedom of the press and for the right of citizens to know that which governments are doing behind their backs, supposedly on their behalf. Julian has never been charged of anything. His name has been dragged through the mud over the Swedish case. Even progressives were cajoled into believing that he was running away from Swedish justice on the rape charges. And whenever the supporters of Julian were pointing out that Julian would like nothing more than to face his accusers in Sweden, but the only reason why he's not getting out of the Ecuadorian embassy is because he knew that there was a secret national security apparatus ready to pounce upon him from the United States, simply because he embarrassed the security apparatus by revealing all the information that we now know and cherish regarding the massacres in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the CIA papers in 2017. Even progressives were cajoled into thinking or saying, oh, come on, this is paranoia. He's simply trying to avoid facing up to the charges in Sweden. Now we know, because by an accident, by a cock-up in the United States, the authorities have actually published the charges that are being laid against him, which are effectively spying charges, which means that if Julian steps out of the Ecuadorian embassy, he will be arrested by British police, then he will be extradited to the United States, and then we will never hear from him again. It will be like Chelsea Manning. He will disappear into the Guantanamo-like system. Even his lawyers will not be told what he's being charged with, and that is only for the purposes of making sure that people like you and me and our audience and everybody else out there do not have access to the dirty secrets of our security apparatus, supposedly in our name.
Let's get to Europe now. In Germany, the center is collapsing, as we see in the federal and regional elections. The era Mutti or Angela Merkel is coming to an end, many are saying now. And Brexit, there's a lot of back and forth and a drama. It's also coming to an end. Some are saying it might go on for a longer time. In Italy, the standoff between the EU and Italy about its budget is escalating. So before it was like on the periphery, the problem, and now it seems that the instability is reaching its core. Can you comment briefly on these developments? Is this all due to migration and refugees, or is there something more deeper and underlying at work here?
It has nothing to do with migration, nothing to do with refugees. Our generation has a duty to itself to grasp what is happening to it. And what is happening to our generation is quite simple and complicated at the same time. The simple story is this: 2008 was our generation's 1929. Just like in 1929, it all began with Wall Street. Wall Street is always the earthquake epicenter of capitalism. When capitalism reaches unsustainability levels beyond a certain threshold, then it crashes in Wall Street. This is what happened in 1929, it's what happened in 2008. The inane establishment that was supposedly managing global capitalism, the Davos crowd, to put it this way, were completely caught unawares. They had no idea even of what happened. So they clamped down through an authoritarian policy of socialism for the financiers and austerity for the masses. They tried to keep the lid on a crisis that was beyond their control or understanding. Just like in the 1920s and 30s. the center did not hold. Just like in the 1920s and 30s, you had a cynical attempt to shift the costs of the crisis onto the shoulders of the weakest members of society. And the result was fascism. This is exactly what's happening here. Brexit, Angela Merkel's fall from grace, Matteo Salvini's fascist moment in Italy, Orban in Hungary, the fact that every major center-left or center-right party in Europe is now collapsing. These are all the aftershocks, the after effects of our generation's 1930s. And it is essential for us as Democrats, as progressives, and this is what DiEM25 is trying to do in Europe, to unite across different European countries and forget about the old-fashioned political system, going to a new politics that confronts simultaneously the collapsing ruling class apparatchiks and the rising fascists, nationalists, xenophobes. This is a difficult struggle, but this is our generation's duty.
Since 2017, a lot of movements are springing up. However, when I observe them or research on them, I see that there's no really concrete economic plans, proposals, history, context. What makes DiEM25 different than other movements, and how important is it for young people today to know about basic economics?
The fundamental difference between what we're doing at DiEM25 and all the other progressive and good movements of the past is that all the other movements began by gathering around the table or in central squares or on the streets, united by an emotional urge to change the world, but without a program of how to do it. DiEM25 did it exactly the other way around. We started life, we were inaugurated, as you know, in Berlin in February 2016, and we spent 2 years answering the question, how could things be dealt with, managed differently? What do we do about private debt? What do we do about public debt? What do we do about poverty? How do we fund an anti-poverty program? How do we challenge property rights over capital returns, universal basic dividend? What do we do about a jobs guarantee scheme that will allow people to stay in their communities and not to migrate either within their country or internationally? And we came up with a European New Deal. That's what our program is. Once we had that, and we were convinced by our own program, then we branched out, we created electoral wings everywhere, including here in Germany today, for the purpose of taking this program out onto the streets, into the squares, in meeting rooms. This is a profound difference, and I'm afraid that in answering your question as to why should young people learn about economics, my message to them is, economics is boring, economics sucks, but it is the language in which politics is negotiated and done, and each one of us needs to understand the basics that are necessary so that our participation in the political struggle can be effective.
You mentioned the universal basic dividend. Also, one can interpret this as universal basic income in its essence, I'm talking about. So usually people think it's a leftist idea, but you argue that it entails liberal values as well. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, it's one of those ideas that has adherents in almost every political family. Even ultra-right-wing libertarians support it because they see it as an alternative to a social welfare system. We at DiEM25 do not see it as an alternative to a social welfare system. We see it as something quite separate, but absolutely essential. And to put it very, very simply, we disagree with the idea that it should be funded from taxes, because we think that the major issue of our era, of the era of robotics, of automation, of platform capitalism, of Airbnb, of Uberization, the real issue is that we have conglomerates that now own whole market spaces. And their capital is being produced by you and me. Every time we search something on the Google search engine, we are contributing to the capital of Google, but society, you and me, are not benefiting from the profits of that capital. The returns to that capital are appropriated privately by the shareholders of Google. So our view effectively is a challenge on the capitalist foundation of corporate capitalism in the era of automation. And what we're saying is a chunk of the shares of these conglomerates must be confiscated. and put into a trust fund for society where the dividends fund a universal basic dividend for everyone. Because everyone is now contributing to these people's capital. And even from their perspective, in the end, if we don't do something like that, the increasing concentration of ownership rights in the hands of those conglomerates will create a major chasm between, on the one hand, their capacity to produce stuff, services, whatever, and our capacity to pay for them. So in a sense, we are even saving from themselves, those corporations like Google.
Let's get back to European politics. The finance minister of Germany and France recently came up with an announcement of a progress in a common Eurozone budget, which should entail stuff like quick financial assistance in times of economic crisis, assist in investment and structural reform, and the Eurozone budget will be part of the greater EU budget. Is this what Europe has been waiting for and what the European New Deal is also advocating?
It is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Instead of steering it away from the iceberg, they are adding insult to injury. We do need a Eurozone budget, but they're not proposing a Eurozone budget. They are proposing, this is typical of the European Union. They proclaim something in name so that they don't do it in practice. They proclaimed, remember, in 2012, a banking union. Supposedly we have a banking union in Europe now. We have no banking union in Europe. We have something called a banking union so that we do not have a banking union. So still, you know, if an Italian bank goes bust, it is up to the Italian government to look after it. That is not a banking union. To have a monetary union with national banking systems is an affront to logic. Similarly, to have a monetary union without the Eurozone budget is an affront to logic. So what do? They proclaim that we have a banking union in order not to create one. They proclaim that they're going to have a Eurozone budget. But if you look at the details, what are they proposing? They're proposing to embed within the European Union budget a credit line from which states can borrow money, but then repay them during supposedly the better times. That's not a Eurozone budget. Do you know what this is? This is the Troika, the Greek Troika, at large. A federal budget, a Eurozone budget, should be a budget that is funded through a common safe asset, a common bond. So unless you have a capacity to borrow at the federal level, you don't have a federal government. Unless you have a capacity to impose federal taxes, you don't have a federal budget. So this is not a Eurozone. And also, think about it. This Eurozone budget they're talking about, which is effectively little loans that they will be giving with strings, austerity strings attached to one another, tiny ones. This budget is going to be embedded within the EU budget, which is altogether 1%. Now, for a federal budget to have any macroeconomic significance, you need at least 20% of GDP. Yeah, at least 20% of GDP. This is going to be a fraction of 1% of the. They are pulling our legs. I mean, we have a duty as citizens to look at these proclamations by the French and the German finance ministers and collectively laugh very loudly.
Another proposal that came out of the European Union was a joint military. They're talking about boosting spending in cyber defenses, creating a drone that would serve the European Union. Is this a way to revive capitalism through boosting the military-industrial complex, or is it a good idea given the adventures of NATO, or how do you assess the situation?
If we wanted to boost European capitalism, the obvious thing would have been to invest in a green energy union so that we can have renewable energy across Europe and decouple ourselves from Gazprom and Mr. Putin. That would work very nicely. But instead, we're talking about creating a European army, which is a bit curious and intriguing. Because let's say we were to create a European army. Let's say we have a 1 million strong European army armed to the teeth. What are we going to do with it? Who is going to decide when we are going to send this army into the battlefield? What government? The German government? Mr. Juncker? With what legitimacy? There is nothing more dangerous than sending an army into the battlefield. And there is nothing that demands and deserves more democratic legitimacy than a decision to send young men and women to kill and be killed. The idea of a European army may be fine once we have a European government, but that requires federation. to create a European army without a federal democratic constitution is to create a rogue army that will be detrimental to the interests of the world.
How much time is left until the EU falls apart, and what can individuals, particularly young people, do offline and online to change that fall?
No time. The European Union is at an advanced stage of disintegration. And I don't just mean Brexit. Brexit is one example, a very obvious example. But the way in which the centrifugal forces within Europe are now tearing it apart. Think about the Italian government today, the Hungarian government, the Polish government. Think about what's happening within Germany. You have the CSU in Munich, in Bavaria. You have elements within the CDU. You have a collapsing SPD. You have an FDP which is advocating policies that will certainly destroy the Eurozone in the name of rectitude. So the whole of the European Union is now being pulled apart. There is no time left. We should have acted yesterday. Let's act today, given that we didn't do that.
You're candidating for the European elections, representing DiEM25 from Germany. Why Germany? And also talk about your vision.
DiEM25 started life in Berlin in February 2016. That was not a random choice. As we said during the inauguration in the Volksbühne Theater, nothing good is going to start in Europe until it begins in Germany. The German economy is the powerhouse of Europe. The German people are committed Europeanists to a very large extent, decreasingly so because of the failures of the establishment, but nevertheless, this is the battleground for Europe. It is not Italy, it is not Greece, it is not Portugal. DiEM25 is going to fight in Portugal, in Italy, in Greece, in France, in Ireland, everywhere. But this is the battleground. And my candidacy for the European Parliament in Germany symbolizes the end of the myth that there is a North-South divide, that there is a clash between North Europe and Southern Europe, and our determination to demonstrate to the people of Germany, to the people of Greece, to the people of France, that the real clash is between progressives and authoritarians everywhere. And until and unless we change the mood in Germany, the mood is not going to change anywhere across Europe.
Yanis Varoufakis, best-selling author, activist, and co-founder of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025. Thank you so much for your time again.
Thank you.
And thank you guys for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to donate, because if you don't, we won't be able to produce independent and non-profit news and analysis. My name is Zain Raza. See you guys next time. Welcome to The Source, a program in which we interview whistleblowers, former insiders, and policy experts. My name is Zain Raza. Today I'm joined by the co-founder of the Democracy in Europe movement, former finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis is also running for the upcoming European election and is the author of numerous books, the latest being Talking to My Daughter About the Economy, A Brief History of Capitalism. Yanis, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me again.
Let's start with Julian Assange. In the last interview, we talked about what his case means for press freedoms. Can you talk about what people could actually do to protect Julian Assange and press freedoms?
For a start, people should disengage from the debate about Julian's personal failures or advantages. No one is perfect in this world, and this is not a question of personal ethics. It is a question of freedom of the press. The only reason why we know about Julian is because through WikiLeaks, he created the infrastructure that allows whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning to let us know of crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated in our name. The only reason why he's now withering in Britain's Guantanamo, Belmarsh prison, is precisely that. So we need to organize public support for effectively our own right to know. And we need to do it everywhere.
There's a lot of movements taking place around Europe, whether it's Fridays for Future or the movement against the recent copyright law on the upload filter or the Yellow Vest movements in France. However, there's little to no action when we compare to the 70s and 80s, or if we compare to these movements on militarization. Even though Western military budgets have been increasing billions, if not trillions. For example, the United States spends $643 billion, whereas the European NATO countries spend $246 billion annually. And we're not only talking about the financial costs, I'm also talking about the opportunity costs where this money could have otherwise been spent, and of course the social cost of the people that are on the other receiving end of all these military weapons. The atomic scientists, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, have cited the removal of arms treaties as well as nuclear modernization as a grave threat. What is your assessment on this, and should movements also incorporate a stance against militarization?
Yes, of course they should. And yes, indeed, we are falling into a false sense of safety after the collapse of the Cold War. The clock is edging closer to midnight, the doomsday clock, simply because we have a new arms race. We have new players in that arms race. And we have militarization playing the role of a stabilization mechanism for a highly unstable financial capitalism. But you mentioned something which is quite correct. The fact that we don't have the peace movement and generally the massive demonstrations that we used to have in the 1960s and the 1970s. The reason is really very simple and very sad. These are deflationary times. Your generation, I'm saying yours because you're younger than me, had the bad fortune of experiencing 1929 all over again in 2008. And just like after 1929, there was a period of deflation, negative interest rates, of rubbish jobs replacing good quality jobs. These deflationary periods are not periods of activism. They are periods of depression, both economic and psychological. You'll recall that in the 60s and 70s it was inflationary periods. Inflationary periods have their problems, but at the same time they generate protests and they generate activism on the streets.
So I want to talk about two issues that have gone behind the scene. Due to the Mueller report that's come out at the moment in the United States, one of them is Iran, where we are seeing Trump's administration, from John Bolton to Mike Pompeo, pushing the news on, tightening the news on Iran by removing the treaty that was signed under Obama, as well as increasing up on sanctions, and Venezuela, where many critics are saying this is a sort of a coup d'etat taking place over there, and dozens of European countries have even recognized Juan Guaido. So could you provide DM's official position on this?
Well, let's start with Venezuela. Our official position is that President Maduro has failed the people of Venezuela. He has suspended Chavez's own constitution, and he's introduced unacceptable levels of violence against peaceful demonstrators as a result of a failing economy, an economy which is failing due to the inefficient management of Chavez's socialist experiment by the Venezuelan army. But at the same time, while we are condemning this, we are condemning with equal ferocity any attempt by the United States to strangle Venezuela, to make impossible a debtor structure, which is absolutely essential for the people of Venezuela to breathe again. There is an ongoing coup d'etat. It's been happening now since Chavez's time. Maduro, unfortunately, made it easier for the United States establishment to effect that. To cut the long story short, DiEM25 is very clear. The only saviors of Venezuela must be the Venezuelan people, who must be allowed through free and fair elections and democratic politics to put their house in order.
Let us switch to Europe. In certain countries like Greece and Spain, we're seeing economic growth and a drop in unemployment levels. For example, in Spain, the unemployment level has dropped from 26 to 14% from 2013 to 2018. And in Greece, we're seeing a drop from 27% to 16%. There's also been modest economic growth between 2.5 and 1.9%. Is austerity working in these countries?
Austerity was and remains a catastrophe, and there is no growth. in Greece, it is to add insult to injury, to celebrate the drop in unemployment. Because yes, the unemployment rate has fallen, but it's fallen because young people have migrated from the country. You nuke a country, you kill everyone, there is no unemployment left. That's not a reason to celebrate. As for growth, there is no growth. If you look at value-added income, that is, if you do not count the gigantic taxation that has been imposed on the people of Greece, in terms of gross national disposable income, there is no growth. If you look at the total amount of money that workers are taking home, there is a decline. So the depression is continuing. In Spain, you have more employment, but employment of part-time, precarious nature that has replaced good quality jobs. There is nothing to celebrate in Spain too, especially if you take into consideration the massive increase in private debt. And recall that the reason why Spain fell into a black hole was private debt. Europe is, in 2019, experiencing a new escalation of the same crisis that has been now ravaging Europe, in the Eurozone in particular, for 8-10 years. We have a new period of intensified recession. Here in Germany, as we speak, industrial production is down 5%. In Italy is in recession. France is in a standstill. France is unsustainable within the Eurozone as it is. The crisis is ongoing. All the celebrations of the end of the crisis and of austerity success are, let's say, not just premature, but nonsensical.
Let's switch to climate change, and I want to talk specifically about responsibility and accountability. Should it be the consumers watching what they buy, what they eat, and how they separate their plastic and all waste disposable, or should it be the producers taking responsibility because they assemble all the products? Where do you think is the right balance there?
Neither. Well, consumers can keep recycling and ride bicycles instead of driving their diesel cars. That's not a bad thing, but it is irrelevant. There will be no change, no significant dent into the climate catastrophe when we are messaging our consciousness and conscience through these acts of individual voluntarism. Producers are not going to do anything unless they're forced to do something. So we're failing at the level of organized society, at the level of civilization. What we need to do is we need to spend at least 5% of GDP on the green transition. We need to have physical limits on the growth of bads as opposed to goods. And we need to combine the macro and the micro, but at the level of what we call TM25, a Green New Deal, which we have spent 2 or 3 years working out what it should be.
You talked about the Green New Deal. In a recent article for The Guardian you wrote, the title is, "It's time for nations to unite around an international Green New Deal." Can you talk about the 3 points that you mentioned, production, innovation, and reparations, and also talk about what role the Progressive International should be playing in this?
Well, beginning with production, it is clear that we should shift the mode of production towards one that actually produces useful things and stops producing things that are destroying the planet and which are really doing nothing for our happiness or soul. That will require massive investment of the excess liquidity, which is now at a planetary level, reaching the volume of around $20 to $30 trillion of idle savings that have not been invested into things we need. We need to take this money and we need to invest it in green technologies, green energy in particular, green transport, and also green agriculture. When it comes to the question of reparations, none of this is going to work if we keep asking the countries around the world that suffered for centuries European and American colonialism to foot the bill, to put limits on their attempts to reverse years and centuries of poverty. There have to be reparations. There has to be a redistribution of wealth, not just income, from the global north to the global south. And finally, innovation. We need a new Manhattan Project. When America and the Allies in the 1940s were facing a clear and present danger of Hitler getting the atomic weapon, they took the best scientists in the world and put them in Los Alamos, and they said to them, okay, whatever it costs, fix it. Get the nuclear bomb before the Nazis do. We are facing a similar kind of catastrophe. We need to invest in innovation at that kind of level, not by putting the best scientists in one place, but creating an international network of scientific research that will be the next step in creating renewable energy.
We have only 2 minutes left, so to my last question. In 2014, during the European election, we saw all-time lows in participation. Only 43% of people joined. How important is it to take part in these elections?
Well, you know, I come from a country where, in my youth, we had fascist dictatorship. And I saw people give their lives for the right to vote. You've got to vote, because people fought and died for your right to vote. And if you don't vote, then the establishment and the authoritarians are going to ruin this world for yourselves and for your children. This is why we are running here in Germany with Demokratie in Europa and across Europe with the European Spring.
Yanis Varoufakis, co-founder of the Democracy in Europe movement, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you guys for tuning in. If you like this content, be sure to click on subscribe and to donate so we can continue to remain independent, free from corporate and state influence. My name is Zain Raza. See you guys next time.
I came here to visit my great friend and fighter for press freedom, for you folks, you the journalists, because you are on Donald Trump's hit list next. I came here to give you courage, and I ended up receiving a lot of strength from him. Julian is in a very dark place. You have to publicize this. He's in solitary confinement. Today, for instance, he will spend 22 hours of his own in the cell. The only 2 hours of the 24-hour cycle that he's not going to spend on his own was with us. When he sees people like us today, he doesn't even get the half hour, the 30 minutes of exercise in an enclosed space. He doesn't even get that. For 6 months he's been asking for, as a prisoner, his right to exercise in the gymnasium with the other prisoners. He has been denied that. So how is he? He's a force of nature, because I can tell you that I would not be able to even open my mouth and utter a single sentence. His mind is working overtime. He's constantly thinking of the merits of the case. It really does not matter what you and I think about Julian Assange. He's only being charged with journalism. The only reason why he's in there is because he embarrassed those who commit crimes against humanity, war crimes. People who are out there profiting, not just being free, but profiting, while the person who exposed them, who allowed the international media, the liberal media, to know what happened in Afghanistan, to know what happened in Iraq. That person is now rotting in there. We have to stop this extradition in the interests of 300 years of modernity, 300 years of trying to establish human rights and civil liberties in the West, around the world. Thank you.
This is Reporters Without Borders. Can you introduce it, please?
Christophe Deloire, Reporters Without Borders. The question is not, are you part of the family or not? Do you like Julian Assange or not? The question is that tomorrow, in this courtroom, journalism will be in danger. Because if Assange would be extradited to the US, it would be the sign that journalism is considered as espionage, and it would endanger all journalists who want to cover the lies of governments, whatever the country, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in other countries. And of course, this is a question of press freedom, what happens here goes beyond the question of an individual fate. We have also to say that Assange has been politically and legally persecuted, and that has to stop now.
Yanis, thank you for joining us today. Yesterday you were telling us that you'll go to Belmarsh prison, now you've come out. Tell us how you're feeling right now.
Concerned. The persecution of Julian Assange is continuing. The circumstances in which he is held in there are an affront to civilization. He spends 22 hours, sometimes more, in a cell on his own with effective sensory deprivation, without human contact. On good days, he has 30 minutes of walking in a yard where he can see a little bit of the sky for 30 minutes on a good day. Today he's not getting this. Why? Because today he was given 2 hours with me and with his father. It is astonishing that there should be such a trade-off. If he sees his father, he cannot walk for half an hour under the sky. Today, of all days, a day before the trial begins tomorrow, the court case begins tomorrow, as he was trying to gather his thoughts, 24 hours before he appears in front of the court, they chose to search his cell. A long, arduous, offensive searching of his cell. For what? The whole purpose of that was to destabilize him a day before the court case. Now, this is not behavior that befits a liberal European country. Still, I maintain hope, and I cling on to the optimism that in the end there will be judges in this country that will assert their independence. I take heart from the fact that Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition, asked a question during Prime Minister's question time in the House of Commons, which was very good in the sense that it exposed what is happening here. And I'm even more heartened that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, gave a good answer, an answer that did not invoke national security or any of the pretend charges against Julian, but he spoke to the heart of the matter about civil liberties. So there is hope. And I do hope that in the end, what's happening there is going to be extinguished by the triumph of justice. And finally, if I may add another comment, I feel very sad about what the system is doing to the prison wardens in there, because these are workers, they're public servants. How do they feel being part of a system that tortures a wonderful person like Julian Assange? If you think about the prison wardens of Nelson Mandela, of all the fighters for freedom and press freedom and for all of us to have the rights that we have, their lives were poisoned by being forced by their superiors to be part of a crime against people who are fighting for everyone. The prison wardens working in there do not deserve to be put into the position of torturing on behalf of a corrupt system Julian Assange.
You were mentioning the UK government, but we are from Germany. Our government has neither denied or confirmed the existence of Niels Melzer's report. You've also had your share of experience with the German government as a finance minister, former finance minister of Greece. What are your comments on the stance of our German government, which is to completely deny nor accept Niels Melzer's report on the torture of Julian Assange?
My message to the German government is, you know that you've been bugged by the NSA. You know that Angela Merkel's phone was being tapped by the United States. You know that Donald Trump and his administration and the national security apparatus is all about splitting us up, Europeans, dividing us and ruling over us. It is about time that you look at Julian Assange's case as a golden opportunity to assert European pride in our liberal democratic traditions. I'm very impressed by the change of tide in Germany. Politicians in Germany, even from the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, whatever our differences might be, seem to have grasped the importance of taking a stance. So I want to commend them. I want to commend German parliamentarians from all sides of the Bundestag for being part of this. The German government should take its own first step in the direction which serves the interests of European civil liberty.
To my last question, we want to leave our viewers with solutions. So you saw, as the former finance minister of Greece, you saw how European democracy is declining. This is probably another stone to that. So how do you see the vision of future for democracy in Europe? And secondly, what is DiEM25 doing to support Julian Assange?
Well, DiEM25 has been at the forefront of supporting Julian Assange. When we were inaugurated in Berlin in February 2016, he was there on a screen from the Ecuadorian embassy. So he's part of us and we're part of him. About democracy in Europe, well, this is a very large question, is it not? But let's begin with one little step towards democracy. Transparency. Let's live stream the meetings of EU councils. Let's have minutes being taken in Eurogroup meetings. It's a small step to make, but it's exceptionally radical.
Yanis Varoufakis, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks again.
Thank you. Hello, this is Yanis Varoufakis on behalf of DiEM25, our Democracy in Europe movement, with some thoughts about the impact of, the epidemic, not just on our daily lives and our health, but primarily on our economy, on our politics, on our morality, on the way we deal with asymmetric or symmetric threats. This epidemic, like all epidemics, has these two separate but of course related realms. One is the impact on our health, on the way it changes our lives with isolation, with the cessation of normal activities, fear of illness, but at the same time there is the epidemic that spreads throughout the political economy of global capitalism. Undoubtedly, the coronavirus is going to accelerate the post-2008 crisis. Now, don't let anyone tell you that that crisis ended and now we have a new one. The 2008 crisis never ended. It morphed into different forms. It traveled from one continent to another. It took different forms, but nevertheless, it has always been with us. The world never went back to some kind of equilibrium after 2008. Capitalism is unrecognizable today by means of terms of references from the period before 2008. What the coronavirus has done is it has deepened and accelerated the never-ending, non-stop crisis that began in 2008. If you think about it, the reason why there's been a semblance of normality, of recovery after 2010, 2011, was because central banks and governments took it upon themselves to refloat the financial markets and to rebuild the circuits of financialized capital by printing trillions and trillions, mountain ranges of money, and throwing them at the 0.1% at corporations that were already full of money. Take Apple, Google, and so on, borrowing free money from the Federal Reserve in the United States, for instance, in order to buy back their own shares. All that was doing was boosting inequality massively, stabilizing financial markets, but at the same time depleting all serious investment in good quality jobs, in labor, in health, in education, in the green transition that this planet needs. This is why there's been so much discontent even before COVID-19 arrived on the scene. So when COVID-19 arrived on the scene, it found a global capitalism that was sitting on a gigantic bubble of private debt that had been minted by central banks on behalf of financial capital. So the problem is not stock exchanges going up and down. Every catastrophic collapse of the stock exchange can easily be followed by a remarkable
boost, the indices going through the roof. But even if the central banks of the world, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, even if they manage to refloat capitalism again, in the same way that they did in 2008, 2009, that is not going to bring us to where we were before COVID-19. And that is so for a very, very simple reason. COVID-19 has pricked the bubble on which financial capitalism was sitting up until now. So even if the financial markets are refloated once more, the level of investment is going to be even lower than it was a few months ago. And let us not forget that a few months ago, the level of investment, especially in important stuff, in things that humanity needs, tangible goods, green energy and so on, the level of investment in relation to the available liquidity and savings has never been lower than it was even before the coronavirus hit. Imagine what it will be like afterwards. Now, what defenses does financialized capitalism have today compared to 2008? This comparison is quite instructive between 2008 and 2020. In 2008, two things saved global capitalism: the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of the United States, and China. Of course, later governments in Europe, the International Monetary Fund and so on, did much in order to complete the job that the Fed and China began by shifting cynically gigantic amounts of losses from the private banks onto the shoulders of the weakest taxpayers, what we in DiEM25 refer to as socialism for the very, very few, for the bankers, and harsh austerity for the many. But it was China and the Fed that were the pillars that kept financial capitalism going. Both these pillars are today highly depleted. Coronavirus started in China. It damaged significantly the capacity of the Chinese political economy to produce surpluses. It shut down factories. It reduced the growth rate below zero. And therefore, it did exactly the opposite to China compared to what happened with the financial crisis in 2008. China is not today in a position to do what needs to be done in order to boost aggregate demand in Germany, in Holland, in Japan, in the United States. China is a patient now. It is not the medical provider. The Federal Reserve could potentially repeat that magnificent feat of 2009 because, unbeknownst to many people, in 2009 the Federal Reserve extended what is called in the business dollar swap lines to the European Central Bank and to the Bank of Japan and to the Bank of England and to many other central banks. Effectively, the Federal Reserve said to them, we will give you as many dollars as you need in order to cover your positions, your bets in dollars that had gone up in the air. Trillions of dollars were provided by the Federal Reserve to the inane, ridiculous bankers of Germany, of France, of Greece, of Japan, and so on and so forth, and therefore refloated them. They could do this again now. But there are two problems. First, as I said before, this is not going to restore the capacity of capitalism to invest in important things and in good quality jobs. That capacity is going to be lessened, even from the ridiculously low levels that we had before the coronavirus hit. But there is another problem. It's called Donald Trump in the White House. Will Mr. Trump sit idly by watching the Federal Reserve provide swap lines to Germany, to the European Central Bank, to Japan, to China, if needs be? I very much fear that he's going to try to attach strings to any such dollar swaps. And if you do try to attach strings and to try to use this as a negotiating tool with the European Union or with China, those strings destroy the efficacy of the dollar swap lines. It sounds like a technical issue. It's not a technical issue. It's a question of brute force. In 2008, 2009, the Federal Reserve used the exorbitant privilege of having the capacity to issue dollars in order to save financial capital in the rest of the world. Is Donald Trump interested in doing that? If he's not interested in doing that, the repercussion would be very simple. We're going to have an even deeper crisis, a deeper recession with tangible effects on the lives of people from Hong Kong and Shanghai all the way to Finland, Portugal, Iceland, everywhere. This is why this epidemic is of great significance to real people's lives across the world. If there are any lessons to be learned from this latest development in the global political economy, it is twofold. Firstly, the importance of public health systems, and secondly, how crucial it is to use public finance for the benefit of the many, not the few. I'll begin with public health. Have you noticed that private health providers resemble rats that are jumping off the sinking ship? Have you heard anything being discussed regarding the contribution of private hospitals and private healthcare during this crisis of the coronavirus-induced dynamic? No, they are nowhere to be seen. All the discussion in the media, the very same media that before the coronavirus hit were going on and on about private-public partnerships and how important it is to push money towards private healthcare because that's more efficient than public healthcare. That's the narrative of the privileged, if you want, which dominated for so many years, decades, in the West after Thatcher and Reagan. The very same media that were extolling the virtues of privatization of hospitals, of private-public partnerships and so on, today only talk about the importance of utilizing the public health service in order to save our bacon, to save our lives, and to ameliorate the effects from the coronavirus. I'm going to make a very strong statement. I'm not just going to say that private health care is inefficient. No, it's not just that they are inefficient. They are destructive. Every euro, every yen, every dollar which is being spent on private health services detracts, not only does not add enough, but detracts from the capacity of humanity to deal with pandemics. It is about time we eradicate private health service. There is not even a liberal argument in favor of private health insurance, of private health systems. They do not work even by the standards of liberal economic, pro-capitalist, pro-market thinking. And then there is, of course, fiscal policy. It is interesting that even the Federal Reserve, especially the European Central Bank, under its new president, Christine Lagarde, who, by the way, gets a score of precisely 0 out of her first attempt to intervene a few days ago with a press conference in order to steady the nerves of the markets and to show that the European Central Bank will do whatever it takes in order to save, again, the euro's bacon and to stabilize the economy. She failed spectacularly. She made 2 gaffes. I'm not going to go into them. Close the parenthesis on this. Even she, nevertheless, came out and said, look, our ammunition as a central bank has been spent over the last 10 years. She didn't use those words, but that's what she meant. We have refloated financial markets. There's nothing we can do. Think about it. The European Central Bank has a negative interest rate of minus 0.5%. It keeps buying all sorts of debt, private debt, public debt, and so on. It is at the end of its tether. And she, on behalf of the extremely conservative European Central Bank, looked at prime ministers and presidents in the eye and said, it's your job now to borrow and spend. And what are they doing? It is astonishing. The other day there was a Eurogroup meeting, the meeting of the European Union's finance ministers of the countries that are using the euro. And it was a teleconference. They decided that the coronavirus poses a clear and present danger of a massive recession in Europe, that it is a highly significant threat to European economies. So much so, the urgency was so great that they decided to do absolutely nothing. they decided that they are going to monitor the situation, that they're going to be watching. You see, what happens is the Eurogroup and the European Union, and in particular the Eurozone, is so terribly structured that they are on autopilot. They simply follow particular rules that cannot be followed without wrecking our economies. This is not just a reflection of inanity, it is that as well, but it is a reflection of a system that has been created in order to prevent governments from acting on behalf of society. That is, if you want, the neoliberal kernel inside the Eurogroup. They are talking about doing whatever it takes within the fiscal compact, which means nothing, because the fiscal compact is like an iron cage of austerity from which you cannot escape. And you need to escape from an iron cage of austerity if you're going to do anything about the green transition, which is so essential, or about dealing with the wholesale recession that the coronavirus is going to bring again to a Europe that has fallen behind the rest of the world as a result of such a stringent austerity package that began in Greece in 2010 and then spread out like a cancer out of control throughout the European Union. So let's recap. We live in a world which is not governed in a way that allows us to see any light at the end of the tunnel regarding the handling of capitalism's never-ending crisis, which the coronavirus has now turbocharged. The European Union has never been less competent than it is now. The European Union has never been less capable of acting as a union than it is now. DiEM25's proposals over the last 4 years since our inception about a common investment policy based on an alliance between our investment bank, the European Investment Bank, the European Central Bank, about a universal basic dividend, about a carbon tax, and about a social equity fund, the purpose of which will be to energize both private capital and public finance or public financial instruments in order to take the mountain ranges of liquidity that exist in our financial circuits and put it into good use, press them into public service in terms of public health, in terms of the green transition, in terms of creating good quality jobs. That agenda of DiEM25 has never been more pertinent and has never been more urgent than today. So we can see that all the arguments of the liberal establishment, effectively business as usual, it took one little virus in order to wreck them. We've seen that the idea of Lexit, of a left-wing exit from the European Union, all it did was it strengthened people like Boris Johnson and the right-wing exiteers, the nationalists, the ones who want to build taller walls between our countries, and the ones who are benefiting politically by turning one proud nation against another, one person against another, one member of the working class against another member of the working class. We have seen the inability of existing nation-state-based political parties to come together and to issue a common manifesto, a common policy agenda for the whole of the European Union. DiEM25 is the only one that has done it. We did have our Green New Deal. We do have it. The Green New Deal can very easily be seen as the only foundation on which we can build simultaneously the investment in the green transition, which is essential in order to keep us breathing on this planet, and the public health services that are essential for dealing with a pandemic like this one. On behalf of DiEM25, Carpe Diem, as we say, the world is going to become a worse place very, very soon, but it is up to us to fight in the context of a transnational movement like what DiEM25 is building in Europe, like what the Progressive International is doing across the world. We'll have more to say about this later on, especially in September, when we reconvene the Progressive International in Reykjavik in Iceland. It is essential that we keep struggling because our ideas and our blueprint make sense, they are rational, they are immediately implementable. All we need to do is to change the politics of a continent, Europe, that is finding it impossible to reproduce itself
under the present circumstances, without the fundamental, profound, transnational, progressive politics that we advocate as DiEM25. Thank you. President Biden, why are you afraid of Julian Assange? Boris Johnson, Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, the great and the good, tyrants, tin pot dictators, and democratically elected leaders seem to be scared of Julian Assange. The question is why? Well, we know why, don't we? Through WikiLeaks, Julian succeeded in terrorizing Big Brother. He took Big Brother's technologies, constructed a digital mirror out of them, a huge one, and turned it towards the face of Big Brother. So we, who are being watched by Big Brother, can watch Big Brother watching us. Nothing terrifies Big Brother more than that. The beauty of WikiLeaks is that it operates like an international, a global letterbox, where any whistleblower can post and place within it information that concerns all of us. WikiLeaks checks it out. They don't even know who it was that deposited that information. This is how they guarantee that no one can find out if they don't know themselves, and then allows us to know what Big Brother, big business, the big states are doing on our behalf, behind our backs, supposedly in order to keep us safe, while procuring the greatest insecurity and committing the worst crimes against humanity. This is why you are killing slowly, intentionally, in a premeditated criminal fashion, Julian Assange's body every day in Britain's Guantanamo, in Belmarsh. This is why we are looking at you in the eye, in the same way that WikiLeaks has allowed us to look at Big Brother's eye. And we are telling you in no uncertain terms. You stand accused of criminality and of murdering a man that made it possible for the rest of us to know your crimes. We shall not rest until those who perpetrate the crimes and those who cover up for them, like President Biden, President Macron, Mrs. Angela Merkel, Mr. Boris Johnson, the rest of those of you in supposed authority, are held into account. Meanwhile, with a smile on our face, we wish Julian Assange a very happy birthday. Carpe diem. Well, first they are getting Julian, then they will get you, me, everyone. This is a clear struggle for freedom of the press and for the right of citizens to know that which governments are doing behind their backs, supposedly on their behalf. The circumstances in which he is held in there are an affront to civilization.
So I think this case is absolutely devastating, horrifying, and wide-reaching implications for press freedom and journalism as a whole. And unfortunately, people have already made up their mind about Julian Assange. They're not taking a stand the way they should be.
He is being punished, as is Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, for releasing the truth.
Every single human right of Julian's has been arbitrarily broken. Distortions of procedure, falsification of witness statements, the lot, the whole rotten lot of it.
He's on death row. He will be on death row if he is extradited.
If this man gets extradited to the United States, he will be tortured until the day he dies.
It may now be Julian, and it may now be Glenn Greenwald, but who will be next?
Julian is a publisher. Julian is also a son. He's a friend. He's my fiancé. And a father. Julian needs his freedom. And our democracy needs a free press.
Yes, it is about Julian Assange, but it is much more also about all of you and your children and your families. And 20 years from now, will you still be able to know the truth about what your government is doing? Or when it has become a crime to inform you about what your government is doing with your tax money to other people that have not done anything wrong in their lives?
Hi everyone.
Taylor Hudak with acTVism Munich. I'm in London outside the Old Bailey Courthouse. Hi everyone, I'm Taylor Hudak and I'm outside London's Belmarsh prison.
We are all Julian Assange. How would you know about all the crimes committed in our names if there weren't the billions of leaks published by WikiLeaks?
If wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by truth.
We're going to lock people away facing 200 years in prison for exposing war crimes. What kind of country, what kind of world are we going to live in? So we have to stand up and collectively say no more.
If you're an activist of any kind, right, left, center, an animal rights activist, an environmental activist, a socialist activist, any kind of an activist against global institutions, and you're not capable of setting aside whatever emotional feelings you have for Julian Assange to defend basic press freedom and stand opposed to the efforts of the Trump government and Boris Johnson's Tory government to criminalize the activities of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and publishing information in the public interest, you are going to create a world for yourself in which the precedents you're now acquiescing to or cheering out of some misplaced hatred for Julian Assange are going to be used against you.
When you're in a dark room, one person switching on the light will make everyone see, right? Don't look for the light somewhere else. Go and switch it on yourself.
We should all thank Julian for his courage and integrity in providing us with this precious gift at great cost to himself, much to our shame.
Think about the opportunities that you have, right? Because there are no heroes. Nobody's going to save you, right? There are only heroic actions. There are only heroic choices. There are only people who moment by moment see bad things and recognize, maybe I can do something. Maybe I can't fix everything, but maybe I can make progress. Maybe I can make things better. Maybe I am the one that I'm waiting for. And as soon as you start thinking like that, you'll realize that you are.
Free Assange, rock and roll.
These are the building blocks that make up our organization and the goals we would like to achieve. In order to continue our journalism until 2022 and realize these values fundamental to our democracy, we need 1,000 supporters in our crowdfunding campaign, donating only €5 or dollars per month via Patreon or bank account. Right now, we have only 200 supporters and are not able to take the next step. Our future is in your hands. Strengthen independent journalism and be part of meaningful change.